The laughter hit harder than any slap. 200 guests turned to stare champagne glasses, pausing mid-air as my sister's voice sliced through the music. "Look at her dress. She looks like the help." My parents laughed. My mother added almost proudly, "She's embarrassing us again." And just like that, every eye in the ballroom landed on me, the plain one, the quiet one, the one who never fought back. But that night something changed. Because before I could even breathe, the groom, her perfect, charming groom, stood up. He crossed the room, his shoes echoing on the marble floor, and everyone fell silent. Then in front of 200 stunned guests, he bowed, and with a voice trembling with respect, he said, "Mom, it's an honor to finally meet you." My sister's smile shattered. My mother's face drained of color. They had no idea who they'd just mocked and what was about to come next. By the end of this story, every cruel laugh, every insult, every lie will be answered. Because sometimes the quiet one isn't weak. She's just waiting for the right moment to rise. My name is Stephanie Cooper. I'm 36 years old and work as a biomedical researcher in Boston. Most people would never guess that the quiet woman who spends her days in a lab has helped save more lives than she can count. I don't wear designer clothes, I don't post about my work, and I don't talk much at family dinners, mostly because no one ever asks. My sister Vanessa has always been the star. She's 3 years younger, and since the day she was born, my parents have looked at her like she was a miracle. She's beautiful, charming, and has a way of filling every room she walks into. I was the quiet one, the serious one. In my family, that word was never meant as a compliment. The Sunday before Vanessa's wedding, we had dinner at my parents' house. It was supposed to be a family gathering, but it felt more like a press conference for Vanessa's big day. The dining table was set with our mother's best china, and the air smelled like roasted chicken and lavender candles. I sat across from Vanessa as she scrolled through photos on her phone, showing everyone the custom floral arrangements, her designer gown, and the private vineyard where the ceremony would take place. 200 guests, she said proudly, and every one of them important. She glanced at me briefly, her lips curving into a smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "You'll come, right, Steph? It would look strange if my own sister wasn't there." I nodded, though my stomach turned. I had planned to go, of course. No matter how many times I'd been humiliated or overlooked, some part of me still believed that if I kept showing up, maybe someday my family would see me. But that hope was wearing thin. My mother poured more wine and said, "Vanessa, darling, the dress-fitting photos were stunning. You looked like royalty. Just wait until everyone sees you walking down the aisle." Then she turned to me, her smile fading. "Steph, have you found something to wear yet?" I hesitated. Not yet. I thought I'd find something simple. Elegant, but not flashy. "Simple," Vanessa repeated with a laugh. "That's your specialty." My father chuckled softly, not even looking up from his plate. My mother sighed, swirling her wine glass. "Just promise us you won't wear anything strange again. The last time you came to an event, people thought you were one of the catering staff." The memory burned in my mind the charity gala 2 years earlier when I'd worn a black suit because I'd come straight from the lab. Vanessa had been there too, in a red gown that made her the centre of every photo. I had stood in the background holding a glass of water, invisible. "I'll make sure I blend in," I said quietly. My father finally looked up. "That would be nice. Just behave for once, Steph." The words hit harder than he realised. Behave. As if my existence was an act of misbehaviour. I forced a small smile and looked down at my plate. The sound of laughter and silverware filled the room, but it all felt far away. I found myself staring at the candlelight flickering across the polished wood, wondering how a family could feel so familiar and yet so foreign. Vanessa leaned toward our mother, whispering something that made them both laugh again. I could guess what it was about. My clothes, my hair, my quietness. They'd been making the same jokes for years, and yet, as I watched them, something in me shifted, something small but certain. I wasn't angry, not exactly. It was more like a quiet recognition that I didn't belong in their version of life anymore. I'd built my own world far from theirs, a world of patience, precision, and purpose. I just never let them see it. The rest of dinner passed in polite conversation about Vanessa's honeymoon in Italy, the guest list, and the expensive photographer she'd hired. When dessert came, my mother asked if I'd bring a +1. I shook my head. No, I said. I'll come alone. Vanessa smirked. Of course. Later that night, when I got home, I stood in front of my closet for a long time. My fingers brushed over a simple blue dress, hanging near the back, the one my mother had sewn for me years ago. It was soft, a little old-fashioned, but it felt real. I smiled faintly, thinking maybe that was enough. As I turned off the light, my father's words echoed in my head. Just behave for once, Steph. I didn't know it then, but soon that sentence would take on a very different meaning. The last thing I remembered thinking that night was my father's voice echoing through my mind. Just behave for once, Steph. Those words followed me into the quiet of my apartment, into sleep, and into the next morning. They were familiar too. Familiar because I'd been hearing versions of them my entire life. It was as if my family had built an unspoken rulebook around me. Stay small, stay silent, stay out of the way. The morning light spilled through the blinds, painting pale stripes across my small kitchen table. I sat there with a mug of coffee, staring at my phone. A new message blinked from Vanessa. Don't wear anything fancy. You'll ruin my pictures. I set the phone down slowly. There it was. Again, the same tone, the same control, the same belief that I existed only as a backdrop to her life. It didn't sting as sharply as it used to. Maybe I'd learned to expect it. But even as I told myself I was used to it, a dull ache pressed somewhere deep inside me, an ache that felt older than either of us. I took a long sip of coffee, closed my eyes, and let my mind drift back to where it all began, to the first time I realized that love in our house wasn't something freely given. It was something earned, and I was never very good at earning it. I must have been about 7 when I first saw it clearly. It was my birthday, and I remember sitting at the kitchen table waiting for the cake. Mum came in carrying at candles, flickering, her voice sweet as she sang. For a moment, it felt perfect. But then, Vanessa, only 4 years old, leaned forward and blew out every candle before I could make a wish. The room filled with laughter. My parents clapped. "Oh, Vanessa," Mum said, smiling, "you're such a little firecracker." I sat there smiling too, pretending it didn't matter. No one noticed that I hadn't even gotten to make a wish. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why being quiet made me invisible. I promised myself I'd try harder next year, to speak louder, to be brighter, to be more like her. But every time I tried, I only seemed to get in the way. Vanessa was sunlight. I was the shadow it cast. In school, things were no different. Teachers loved her confidence, her easy laughter. She won awards for cheerleading, for debate, for anything that required standing in front of people. I was the one who stayed after class, helping put away books, keeping my head down. I didn't mind it at first, I liked the quiet, but over time I started to see how my silence gave everyone permission to forget I was there. When I brought home perfect grades, my father said, "That's good, Steph," without looking up from his newspaper. When Vanessa brought home a participation ribbon, he took her out for ice cream. I learned not to expect fairness. I learned not to ask for it. The first time I fell in love, I thought maybe things would be different. His name was Adam, a quiet boy from my high school biology club. We spent afternoons studying together in the library, sharing secrets we never told anyone else. He said I made him feel calm. For once, I felt seen. One Friday night, I invited him over for dinner. Vanessa had just started college, but was home for the weekend. She breezed into the dining room halfway through the meal, her laughter bright and effortless. I remember the way Adam's eyes followed her as she spoke, the way her hand brushed his arm when she reached for the salt. By the end of the evening, I was the one clearing the dishes, while they stood in the doorway talking about a concert he wanted to see. 2 weeks later, they were dating. No one ever said it outright, but everyone knew. Mum called it young love. Dad said it wasn't a big deal. I pretended it wasn't, but something inside me cracked that day, a quiet, steady kind of heartbreak that didn't heal so much as settle into my bones. It taught me a lesson I carried into adulthood, that speaking up doesn't always change anything. Sometimes the only way to survive is to disappear gracefully. That's what I did. I disappeared into my studies, into work, into the lab, where things made sense. In science, rules were fair. Equations balanced. Effort mattered. I liked that. While Vanessa moved from one glamorous job to another, I stayed behind glass walls, building something real, something that might outlive all of us. My success wasn't loud, but it was steady. Still, my family never noticed. To them, I was the same quiet girl in the corner, still waiting for permission to shine. I thought I had made peace with that until now. Until this wedding. Until that message blinking on my phone. Don't wear anything fancy. You'll ruin my pictures. It was so like her to say something cruel and make it sound casual. I should have ignored it, but instead I caught myself typing back, "Don't worry, I'll keep out of the frame." Then I erased the words. I'd learnt long ago that answering only fed the fire. Instead, I tucked the phone into my bag and looked out the window. The city was waking up cars, moving people hurrying to work. I watched a mother and daughter walking down the sidewalk, holding hands, laughing at something only they understood. For a second, I envied them. Not for their happiness, but for how easy it seemed. My own mother and I hadn't laughed together in years. Our conversations were limited to polite questions about my job and gentle reminders about family gatherings. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. I was just tired. Tired of trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided where I belonged. But still, a part of me couldn't let go of the hope that maybe, just maybe, Vanessa's wedding could be a turning point. Maybe it was childish, but I imagined her seeing me, truly seeing me, and realizing I wasn't just the quiet sister in the background. I had done something good with my life. I had made something that mattered. The irony, of course, was that I had never wanted to compete with her. I only ever wanted her to stop treating me like a footnote in her story. I reached into my closet again and ran my fingers over the soft fabric of the blue dress. My mother had made it when I was 20, back when she still sewed on weekends. She told me blue suits you. It's calm but strong. I hadn't worn it in years. That morning, for the first time in a long while, I thought maybe I would, as I zipped up my coat and headed out the door for work. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Vanessa. Make sure to sit near the back during the ceremony. I exhaled slowly. The ache returned, the old familiar one that lived somewhere behind my ribs. For a moment, I thought about not going at all. But then, I remembered something. Something I had once promised myself on that long-ago birthday when my sister blew out my candles. Next time, I'll make my own wish. I slipped the phone into my pocket, whispered softly to the empty hallway, "You'll see me this time," and stepped outside into the cold morning air. That sentence stayed with me the rest of that week, as if saying it out loud had stirred something inside me that refused to settle. I meant those words when I spoke them, but standing in the grey light of early morning, I didn't yet understand how difficult it would be to keep that promise, to be seen, truly seen, in a family that had spent years pretending I wasn't there. By the time Friday came, my resolve had begun to crack. I sat in my lab at the research centre, surrounded by quiet hums of machines and the smell of disinfectant, trying to focus on my work. The glass walls reflected my own image back at me, the neat bun of my hair, the tired eyes, the lab coat with my name embroidered in small blue letters. Outside that glass, assistants hurried past, voices low, purposeful. Inside, I was safe. Out there, I would have to face my family again. I kept checking my phone, hoping for some reason, any reason, not to go. An email from Vanessa, another text from Mum, a meeting at work, something that could excuse me without making me the villain. Nothing came. Just silence. I told myself I didn't owe them anything, that I had every right to say no. But when I thought about the aftermath, the inevitable phone calls, the accusations, the guilt I felt, the same exhaustion that had followed me since childhood. Refusing to go would only prove them right that I was difficult, ungrateful, the sister who never fit. That evening, I called my mother. I told myself I'd be calm, that I'd simply explain I couldn't make it. The moment she answered, I knew how it would go. "Steph, thank goodness," she said, breathless with excitement. "We were just finalising the seating chart. Vanessa wants you near the back on the right side." "You don't mind, do you?" I hesitated. "Actually, Mum, I wanted to talk about the wedding." The pause on the other end was heavy. "What about it? I don't think I should come," I said, my voice careful. "It's a long trip, and with work, don't start this again," she interrupted sharply. "You always find excuses." "It's not an excuse," I said. Your sister would be devastated if you weren't there," she said, her tone softening just enough to sound maternal. "This is her big day, Stephanie. You only get married once." "Not everyone does," I muttered before I could stop myself. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "That's exactly the kind of attitude that embarrasses us. Honestly, Steph, can't you just do this one thing without making it about you?" The words hit the familiar place inside me that always reacted before I could defend myself. The old ache, the one that told me to stay quiet, to surrender. I wanted to hang up. Instead, I found myself nodding even though she couldn't see me. "I'll be there," I said softly. "Good," she replied briskly, her tone brightening. "Oh, and wear something simple, please. We don't want to draw attention away from Vanessa." When she hung up, I just sat there staring at the silent phone in my hand. I knew she hadn't meant it cruelly, not in her mind anyway. It was simply how she spoke to me, the language of dismissal, so ingrained that she probably didn't even hear it anymore. I put the phone down and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. My reflection in the glass looked small and weary. For a moment, I wished I could disappear into the hum of the machines around me, dissolve into data and logic and sterile air. But somewhere beneath the fatigue, a flicker of defiance still lived. I had promised myself I would be seen. I didn't yet know how, but I knew that hiding wasn't an option anymore. The next day, I went shopping for a wedding gift. The store was filled with glittering displays and polite perfume salespeople who spoke in careful tones. I wandered through aisles of crystal vases, engraved picture frames, and fine china, none of which felt right. Then I saw a small box tucked away near the back, a set of silver cufflinks shaped like small curved leaves. Simple, elegant, and understated, the opposite of Vanessa's taste. Still, something about them caught my attention. They reminded me of my father's old cufflinks, the ones he'd worn to every important event. I bought them without thinking, even though I knew he probably wouldn't notice. That night I sat at my kitchen table staring at the blue dress folded neatly across the chair. It looked softer now in the lamplight, like something that belonged to another version of me, a younger one who still hoped to be loved for who she was. I ran my hand over the fabric and thought about the years between that hopeful girl and the woman I'd become. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped trying to change their minds. Maybe that was a kind of peace. Or maybe it was just resignation. I packed, slowly, deliberately, the blue dress, a simple pair of earrings, and the silver cufflinks. Nothing more. Then, I sat back on the edge of the bed, looking at the small suitcase at my feet. The act of packing for this wedding felt heavier than it should have, as if every piece of clothing carried a memory I hadn't asked to bring with me. When I closed my eyes, I could already hear the laughter. At the reception, the polite whispers, the careful glances in my direction. I could see Vanessa's flawless smile, my mother's approving nods, my father's distant stare. I wondered if they'd notice me at all. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee, trying to shake the unease that had settled overnight. My phone buzzed again, another message from Vanessa. "Can you help make sure the guests sign the guest book? You're good with details." I stared at the words for a long moment, then set the phone down without replying. That was the pattern, wasn't it? I was useful, dependable, invisible. Always the one handling the background while she stood in the spotlight. Still, I was going. Not for her, not for them, but for myself. I told myself it wasn't about belonging anymore, it was about closure. If nothing else, this wedding would be the end of something. Maybe not the family I had wished for, but at least the hope that kept me tied to it. That afternoon, I called the airline and booked my ticket. The woman on the phone was polite, her voice gentle and detached. When she asked if I wanted to add travel insurance, I almost laughed. What kind of insurance covers emotional damage? After I hung up, I opened my laptop and checked my work email one last time, before shutting everything down for the weekend. There was one unread message flagged by my assistant, Dr. Cooper, the board wants to see you next week. I frowned, rereading it twice. The board never called meetings with individual researchers unless it was something major. For a moment, the anxiety of my family disappeared, replaced by a sharp, unexpected pulse of curiosity. I closed the laptop slowly, a small smile tugging at my lips. For once, maybe the world outside my family was about to notice me too. That thought carried me through the weekend, like a quiet pulse beneath the surface. By Monday morning, I woke with a mixture of nerves and something that almost felt like hope. I dressed carefully, choosing a pressed navy suit instead of my usual cardigan, and caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked calm, professional, and just a little older than I felt. Maybe that was a good thing. The cab ride to the research facility took 20 minutes. When I stepped inside, the air felt as cool and sterile as always, soft hums from the ventilation, faint clicking of keyboards behind glass walls. Our lab sat at the end of a long hallway, sealed behind multiple security doors. I'd always liked that the separation, the silence. The world outside was messy. In here, things obeyed logic. Equations didn't lie. Machines didn't mock you. I slipped on my lab coat, Dr. S. Cooper embroidered in small blue letters over the pocket, and went straight to my station. The prototype sat on the table under a bright lamp, a small silver device no bigger than a matchbox. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked. It could save lives. I ran my fingers along its edge, thinking how strange it was that something so small could matter so much when entire people like me could go unnoticed for years. Ben, my assistant, appeared with 2 mugs of coffee. "Morning, Dr. Cooper," he said, setting one down beside me. "You look serious, big day. The board meeting," I said, though it came out quieter than I intended. He smiled. "That's right. You know, they don't schedule one-on-ones unless it's good news. I'll believe it when I see it." We spent the morning running data. Numbers, graphs, calibration tests, the language I trusted most. In the hum of machines, my thoughts settled. When Ben finally broke the silence, it startled me. If these results hold the FDA approval, could be sooner than expected. This changes everything. For the patients, I said. That's what matters. He tilted his head. "You really don't care about getting credit, do you?" "I care about the work," I said. "Credit's just noise." He laughed softly. "You're the only person I know who can invent something that saves lives and still call it noise." "The world will soon know your name, Dr. Cooper." I smiled, though not entirely from happiness. Maybe not yet. The words hung between us, half a promise, half a wish. Fame had never tempted me. I'd spent too long learning that attention could turn cruel. My sister had built her entire world around it. I wanted nothing to do with it. By afternoon, the boardroom door loomed in front of me. Through the glass, I saw 5 men in suits waiting, papers spread before them. I smoothed my blazer and stepped inside. "Dr. Cooper," said Dr. Harlow, the chairman. "Please sit. You're aware of the trial results?" "Yes," I said. "The survival rates improved by 12%. He nodded, pleased. "And the feedback?" "All positive, minimal side effects." He exchanged glances with the others. "You've done extraordinary work. The board has voted to move to the public phase, media presentations, publications, interviews. You'll be our lead representative." I froze. "Me?" "Of course," he said warmly. "Every breakthrough needs a face." The room spun for a moment. I'd expected progress, not publicity. "I'd prefer to share the credit," I said carefully. "It was a team effort." We'll mention the team, he assured, but the public connects better with one person. You're that person. I nodded slowly, masking the unease creeping up my spine. A face. That was what they wanted, a single name to attach to a headline. I thought about Vanessa's name flashing across glossy magazines, how she thrived on attention like sunlight. If she ever found out about this, she'd find a way to make it hers. She always did. When the meeting ended, I walked back to the lab in a daze. Ben looked up from the monitors. So, good news? I hesitated, then nodded. They're taking it public, he broke into a grin. That's amazing. Incredible, I echoed softly, though it didn't feel that way. You don't seem excited. I am, I said. It's just, I've worked in silence for so long. It feels strange to suddenly have everyone looking. He studied me for a moment, then smiled kindly. You've earned it. You deserve to be seen. After he left, I stayed behind, staring at the prototype gleaming under the light. It looked so small, so ordinary, yet inside it lived every sleepless night, every failure, every quiet victory I'd never celebrated. Recognition had always felt like something that happened to other people. For me, success had always been silent, a private thing like breathing. I shut down the equipment, turned off the lights, and stood by the window overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered in the distance, sharp and cold against the winter dusk. Somewhere out there, Vanessa was probably rehearsing her wedding vows, planning her grand entrance, her perfect moment. Our worlds couldn't have been more different, hers full of eyes and admiration, mine of solitude and steady light. Still, as I watched the city glow, I realized something. Maybe I didn't need the world to see me. Maybe it was enough to know that I had built something that mattered, even if no one ever attached my name to it. The device on the table didn't care who got the credit. It would save lives all the same. I gathered my things, locked the lab, and walked out into the evening chill. The air smelled faintly of rain and iron. As I stepped into the cab, my phone buzzed with a new message, another reminder about the wedding itinerary from my mother. I didn't open it. Instead, I leaned my head against the window, watching the blur of streetlights pass. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. The world might soon know my name, but I wasn't chasing that. I'd learnt the hard way that the loudest people aren't always the most deserving. Sometimes the quiet ones change everything without saying a word. As the cab turned toward home, I whispered to the reflection in the glass, "Maybe not yet." Those words lingered with me all week as the day of Vanessa's wedding drew closer like a quiet breath before a storm. Maybe not yet. It was half a promise, half a warning, one I didn't even understand at the time. By the morning of the wedding, the sky was a pale blue-grey, washed out by winter light. I stood in front of my mirror again, the same blue dress hanging from my shoulders. The fabric was soft, worn in places, but the colour reminded me of still water, calm and sure of itself. I took a long breath, smoothing the skirt with my palms. I told myself I was ready, though my chest felt tight. The drive to the venue took nearly 2 hours. The estate was enormous, white columns, fountains, and a sweeping lawn that looked more like a movie set than a wedding. Cars lined the circular driveway, glossy and expensive. I parked near the edge where the gravel met the grass and sat in silence for a moment before stepping out. Music drifted faintly from inside the grand hall violins and laughter, the sound of wealth and ease. I felt like an intruder before I even walked through the door. Inside, everything sparkled. Chandeliers hung like frozen rain above the marble floor. Candles flickered in crystal holders, and every woman seemed to shimmer in sequins and silk. I saw familiar faces, neighbours, family friends, people who had once ruffled Vanessa's hair when she was a child, and said she'd grow up to marry someone important. Apparently she had. I stood near the entrance, clutching my small, silver clutch like a lifeline, unsure of where to go. A waiter approached, offering champagne. I shook my head politely, murmuring a quiet thank you. His eyes flicked over my dress, not unkindly, just curious. It was clear I didn't belong here. My blue dress, once beautiful in its simplicity, looked plain under the golden light of the chandeliers. Around me, the other guests gleamed. They were polished people, women with flawless hair, men with practiced smiles. They moved like they were being watched, performing a version of happiness for each other. And then I saw her. Vanessa stood near the staircase, radiant in her wedding gown. The dress hugged her perfectly white satin, with a train that shimmered as she moved. Her makeup was flawless, her hair coiled into perfect curls. She was surrounded by a circle of admirers, her friends, bridesmaids, and, of course, our parents. My mother looked younger, somehow glowing with pride. My father stood tall beside her, his usual indifference softened into something like joy. I watched them laugh at something Vanessa said, and that familiar ache returned, the one that had followed me since childhood. When Vanessa's eyes met mine, her smile tightened, polite but sharp. She excused herself from the group and walked toward me, her heels clicking against the marble. "You came," she said, voice lilting with surprise that wasn't quite genuine. "I said I would," I replied. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my dress. "Well, at least you kept it simple," she said. "That's good." "Simple suits me," I said. She tilted her head, a faint smirk forming. "Yes, I suppose it does." I didn't answer. I'd learned long ago that silence irritated her more than anything I could say. She glanced past me toward the doorway, already distracted by the sound of someone calling her name. Before she walked away, she leaned in and whispered, "Try not to draw too much attention. Okay, this day isn't about you." Then she was gone, swept up in the tide of guests again, laughing, that bright, practiced laugh that made people love her instantly. I stood still for a moment, staring at the space she'd left behind, trying to keep my breathing steady. As the ceremony began, I took my seat near the back, just as instructed. The music swelled, the guests turned, and Vanessa glided down the aisle on my father's arm, smiling like she had been born for this. I wanted to be happy for her, I really did. But as I watched my parents beam, the familiar sense of invisibility crept over me like a shadow. I was there, but not really. Present but unseen. After the ceremony, the reception began, a blur of champagne toasts, clinking glasses, and endless laughter. I stayed near the edge of the room, smiling politely when someone nodded in my direction. Most didn't. Every so often my mother would glance my way and give a small approving nod as if I were a well-trained guest who hadn't caused any trouble. Dinner was served in a glittering ballroom. The tables were draped in gold, the centerpieces tall enough to block conversation. I found my name card near the far end, seated beside an older couple I didn't know. As the meal went on, I could feel eyes sliding toward me now and then women whispering behind manicured hands, men pretending not to notice. It wasn't hostility exactly, just curiosity, confusion. I didn't fit the picture. Then came the speeches. The best man told stories about Vanessa and Mark's first trip together. The maid of honor cried through her toast. And then Vanessa, flushed from champagne, took the microphone. She scanned the room, smiling graciously, and said, "Before I thank everyone, I just want to take a moment to thank my family, especially my parents who taught me everything about love, and my sister." Her voice paused dramatically, and a ripple of laughter moved through the room. "My sister, who," she continued, looking straight at me, "has always been a little shy about these things. She's not one for big events, but I'm so glad she decided to join us tonight." There was polite applause. I smiled, though it felt more like holding my breath. Vanessa laughed softly into the microphone. "She even wore her favourite dress. Isn't it adorable?" She gestured toward me. "Look at her. She looks like the help." For a moment, the room froze. Then a few guests chuckled uncertainly. My mother laughed. First, a light, embarrassed sound that broke the silence. My father followed with a quiet smile, shaking his head as if to say, "That's just Vanessa." And then the laughter spread, muted, polite, the kind of laughter people give when they don't know what else to do. I felt the heat rise in my face, my pulse hammering in my ears. I could see people turning, glancing at me, then quickly looking away. I wanted to move to disappear, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy, rooted to the spot. Vanessa handed the microphone back to the band and took a sip of champagne, utterly unbothered. I sat there smiling faintly, pretending it didn't matter. But it did. Every word she said landed like a stone inside me, one after another, until I could barely breathe. My mother's laughter echoed in my mind, my father's easy smile, the way everyone accepted it as harmless fun. I blinked hard, forcing the tears not to fall, but they came anyway, blurring the golden lights into a haze. I reached for my glass of water, my hand trembling slightly. I told myself to hold it together, to behave just like my father always said. But in that moment, sitting there, under the weight of all those eyes, I realised something. There was no way to behave that would ever make me enough for them. I lowered my gaze to the tablecloth, pretending to study the silverware as the laughter faded and the music swelled again. My throat tightened, my eyes stung, and I smiled one last time so no one would see how much it hurt. Even my parents were still chuckling quietly, shaking their heads at Vanessa's playful humour. And that was when the tears finally fell silent and hot against my cheek. I didn't move to wipe them away. I just sat there frozen, the sound of laughter still echoing faintly over the music. My face burned, my chest felt tight, and I could taste salt when I tried to swallow. Vanessa stood at the head table, a glass of champagne in her hand, glowing under the golden light. Her laughter rang clear above the murmurs, smooth and easy, as if nothing cruel had just happened. "Oh, come on," she said into the microphone, her voice bright and teasing. "Don't look so serious, everyone. It's just a joke. My sister knows I love her." "Right, Steph." 200 faces turned toward me. The room blurred under the lights. I could barely breathe. I managed to nod, though it felt like my neck was made of stone. "It's fine," I said softly, but my voice trembled. "See," Vanessa said cheerfully. "She's always been such a good sport." The crowd laughed politely, the sound brittle and false. I lowered my eyes, gripping my napkin tightly in my lap. I wanted the floor to open up beneath me. But before I could gather myself, another sound cut through the room. So there was a sharp scrape of a chair against the marble floor. The music faltered. Conversation stopped. Everyone turned. Mark, Vanessa's new husband, was standing. For a moment, I thought he was going to calm things down, maybe tell a joke to smooth it over. But the look on his face stopped me cold. It wasn't anger or confusion. It was something quiet, serious, and strange. He walked toward me, his footsteps steady, deliberate. The room fell silent. Even the band stopped playing. Vanessa's smile faded. "Mark," she said uncertainly, her voice thin in the hush. He didn't answer. When he reached my table, he stopped directly in front of me. I felt the eyes of every guest, the weight of every breath, the hum of electric confusion in the air. And then he bowed. Not a polite nod, not a nervous dip of the head, but a full formal bow, the kind of gesture that didn't belong in a ballroom filled with gossip and gold. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear and steady, "it's an honour to finally meet you." For a moment, I didn't understand. I just stared at him frozen. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. My sister's hand tightened around her champagne glass. My mother's smile vanished completely. "I'm sorry," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. Mark straightened. His eyes met mine, calm, respectful, and strangely kind. "You don't know me," he said, "but I know your work. My mother was one of the first patients to receive your heart device, the one you designed." It took a second for the words to register. My mind tried to catch up to what was happening, to understand how this man, my sister's husband, could possibly know about my research. "Your mother," I said faintly. He nodded. "She's alive because of what you built. I recognized your name when I saw the guest list, but I didn't realize you were her sister. I just want to thank you." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the crystal glasses tremble on the tables. A few guests turned toward one another, whispering in disbelief. "She's a doctor," someone murmured. "She invented that device." Vanessa's face had gone pale. "Mark," she said sharply, her voice trembling now. "What are you doing?" "This is my wedding." He looked at her evenly. "It's also the first time I've met the woman who gave my mother 10 more years of life. Forgive me if I think that deserves acknowledgement." The colour drained further from her cheeks. "You're embarrassing me," she hissed. He turned back to me. "Dr. Cooper," he said, using my title as though the whole world had forgotten it until now. "Thank you for everything you've done." I opened my mouth, but no sound came. Every muscle in my body felt tight, trembling with the weight of years of silence, of shrinking, of swallowing my own worth. I nodded, unable to form words. Mark held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a quiet, respectful nod, and returned to his seat. The room stayed frozen, still caught between shock and disbelief. My parents looked like statues. My father's jaw had gone rigid, his eyes unreadable. But my mother, her expression had changed completely. The mask of polite composure she'd worn all night cracked, revealing something raw and shaken beneath. For the first time in my life, she didn't look proud of Vanessa. She looked afraid. Around us, the whispering grew louder. People leaned toward each other, their voices low, but urgent. "Did you hear that she saved his mother's life?" I had no idea. The shift was palpable. The same guests who had laughed minutes earlier now looked at me differently, no longer as the quiet, awkward sister, but with something closer to reverence. Vanessa remained standing at the head table, staring at me like she didn't recognize me. She tried to smile, but her face wouldn't cooperate. Her hand trembled around the microphone still lying in front of her. She didn't reach for it again. I sat completely still, my hands in my lap, heart pounding so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. I wanted to vanish. I wanted to run. And yet, beneath the shock and disbelief, something unexpected was blooming inside me. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't pride. It was clarity. All these years, I'd lived in the shadow of my sister's brilliance, the daughter who sparkled while I worked in silence. And now, without trying, without speaking a single cruel word, the truth had found its way into the light. Mark's bow hadn't humiliated Vanessa. It had revealed her. It had revealed all of them. The chatter grew again, uncertain and uneven. A waiter moved awkwardly between tables, pretending not to notice the tension. Somewhere in the back, someone started clapping, though no one joined in. The music picked up hesitantly, as if the band wasn't sure what to do. I lifted my eyes and met my mother's across the room. Her face was pale, her hand gripping the tablecloth so tightly that her knuckles were white. When our eyes met, she looked away first. In that moment, I understood something I never had before. My mother's power had always come from control over appearances, over silence, over me. But that control was slipping, unraveling in front of all these people. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was frightened of me. I took a slow breath, steadying myself as the murmurs swelled again. I didn't know what would happen next or what this moment would mean for the rest of my family. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. The music rose again, the conversations began to scatter, and the night carried on, though it would never be the same. And, across the room, my mother watched me, her eyes wide, her fingers trembling as though she'd just realised the daughter she'd spent her life underestimating had finally stepped out of the dark. That realisation hung in the air long after the laughter faded. The wedding moved on, music playing, glasses clinking, but everything felt altered, fragile. Guests spoke in softer tones now, careful not to seem cruel or foolish. The story of what had just happened was already spreading from table to table. I could feel the hum of it, like electricity under the surface. For once, people weren't looking through me, they were looking at me. And I didn't know what to do with that attention. I sat still, trying to collect myself, pretending to listen to the music. I didn't want to meet anyone's eyes. My pulse still thudded in my ears, my face warm from the strange collision of embarrassment and something like relief. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something quieter, a release of pressure that had been building for years. After a while, I stood to get some air. The ballroom felt too small, too full of whispers. I slipped out onto the terrace overlooking the gardens. The night was cool and calm, the air carrying the faint scent of roses and rain. I leaned on the stone railing, breathing deeply. The fountain below glimmered in the moonlight, and for the first time that evening, I could hear myself think. A few minutes later, footsteps approached behind me. I turned slightly, half expecting a curious guest, or perhaps even Vanessa. But it was Mark. He had taken off his jacket, his tie slightly loosened, his expression thoughtful. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the music from inside drifting faintly through the open doors. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you," he said quietly. "That wasn't my intention." I shook my head. "You didn't. You just surprised me." He nodded, leaning against the railing beside me. "I suppose I surprised everyone." I smiled faintly. "You did." We stood in silence for a moment, both watching the reflection of the fountain lights ripple across the water. Then he spoke again, his voice low and sincere. "When I recognized your name earlier today on the guest list, I thought it couldn't be the same person. I even asked Vanessa about it. She just laughed and said you were her older sister, that you worked in some kind of lab. I didn't press it. But then, when I saw you tonight, sitting alone, quiet the way people looked at you, I realized it had to be you." I looked down, my hands resting lightly on the railing. "I didn't think anyone outside the medical field even knew my name." "I did," he said simply. "My mother used to talk about you all the time. Not by name at first, but by what you'd done. When she was recovering, she'd tell everyone about the device that gave her another chance. I remember her saying, someone out there cared enough to make this. Later, when she learned who developed it, she made me promise that if I ever met you, I'd thank you." The words caught in my chest. I hadn't expected that. The years I'd spent in the lab had always felt distant from real people. We talked about patients and data, but rarely about faces or names. Hearing that my work had touched someone's mother, his mother, brought a lump to my throat. "I'm glad she's still with you," I said softly. "She's healthy now, stronger than ever." He smiled faintly. "She couldn't come tonight, but she'll be sorry she missed this meeting. She admires you more than anyone." Honestly, he added after a pause, "So do I." I felt my face flush in the cool air. "You don't have to say that." "I mean it," he said. "You're the kind of person people should look up to. You've done more good quietly than most do shouting their accomplishments to the world." I didn't know what to say to that. Compliments had never sat comfortably with me, especially not ones that felt so genuine. "I just did my job," I said finally. He shook his head. "You changed lives. That's more than most of us can say." We stood there for a while, the silence between us gentle, almost peaceful. I could hear laughter drifting from the ballroom, again muted and distant. For the first time that evening, I felt like I could breathe freely. "Thank you," I said at last, turning toward him. "For saying what you did, for standing up back there. You didn't have to." He smiled slightly. "Yes, I did. Some things shouldn't go unacknowledged." He looked at me, his eyes steady, especially when the truth has been ignored for too long. I nodded, unable to respond. It was strange hearing words that mirrored what I'd felt for so long, but had never said aloud. For a moment, it was easy to forget where we were, forget the wedding, the crowd, the tension simmering just beyond those glass doors. It was just two people talking under the moonlight, sharing an understanding that didn't need many words. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the doorway. A figure stood half hidden in the shadows, just inside the light from the ballroom spilling across the marble floor. Even before my eyes adjusted, I knew who it was. Vanessa. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, her expression unreadable from where I stood. But I didn't need to see her face to know what she was thinking. Mark turned, following my gaze. "Vanessa," he said, softly, surprised. "I didn't see you there." She didn't answer. She just stared at us, the silence between her words, louder than anything she could have said. Then, without speaking, she turned and disappeared back inside. Mark frowned, running a hand through his hair. "I should probably go after her," he said reluctantly. She's had a long day." "I understand," I said. "And I did." He hesitated. "For what it's worth, I'm glad I met you tonight. My Mother will be too. Tell her I said thank you, I replied quietly. He nodded once more, then walked back toward the ballroom, his figure framed by the glow of the chandeliers as he disappeared inside. I stayed on the terrace a while longer, the cool night air brushing against my face, the sound of distant laughter drifting faintly toward me. I should have felt vindicated or proud, but instead I just felt small. Not in the way I used to, but in the way that comes from realizing how much bigger the world is than you thought. The stars shimmered faintly above the gardens, and I whispered to myself, maybe not yet, though I wasn't sure what I meant anymore. Through the open doorway, I caught a final glimpse of Vanessa's reflection in one of the mirrors across the room. Her face was tight pale, her eyes cold with something sharp and dangerous. Whatever she thought she had seen, I knew one thing for certain: she had misunderstood everything. And somehow, I sensed that misunderstanding was about to cost us both. I was right. The next morning, the consequences began. I had stayed the night in a small hotel near the venue, too drained to make the long drive home. When I woke, my phone was already buzzing with notifications, texts from relatives, missed calls from my parents, and one long message from Vanessa. I hesitated before opening it, my stomach already tight. "You've gone too far this time," it began. "I can't believe you'd humiliate me like that flirting with my husband at my wedding. Everyone saw you out there. What were you thinking?" I read the words twice, then set the phone down on the table. The accusation wasn't a surprise. It was exactly the kind of narrative she would build to protect herself. Still seeing it written out, seeing her anger turned into something so false, made my hands tremble. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but my heart was already pounding. An hour later, I was pulling into my parents' driveway. The wedding decorations still clung to the fence, white ribbons fluttering weakly in the morning breeze. The house looked the same as it always had, neat and quiet, but there was tension in the air I could feel even before I stepped inside. My mother met me in the living room. She was still in her silk robe, hair pinned back tightly, a coffee cup in hand. Her expression was sharp and cold. "Stephanie," she said, "Vanessa called us this morning." I nodded slowly. "I'm sure she did. She's devastated," my mother continued. "Humiliated. People are talking about what happened last night, and she's in tears. How could you do that to her?" I stared at her, speechless. "Do what to her?" "Don't play innocent," she snapped. "We saw you on the terrace. You and Mark alone, whispering. You knew people would notice." "On her wedding night, Stephanie, really?" I felt the heat rise to my face. "You think I was flirting with him?" My father entered the room, then still wearing the same suit jacket from the night before. He looked tired, but his tone was firm. "We're not saying it was intentional," he said, "but you should have known better. You've always had this habit of making things about yourself." The words hit me like a slap. "I didn't make anything about me," I said, my voice trembling. "Mark was thanking me for saving his mother's life. That's all." My mother's eyes narrowed. "So now you're the hero in this story." "It's not a story," I said quietly. "It's the truth." My father sighed heavily as if he were the one being wronged. "You've embarrassed us, Steph. Vanessa's friends are calling, asking what that display was about. The least you could do is apologize to her." Apologize? That single word echoed in my head. I'd spent my entire life apologizing, sometimes for things I hadn't done, sometimes just for existing. But this time, something in me resisted. I looked from one parent to the other, realizing how deeply they wanted to believe the version of events that made their golden daughter blameless. "I won't apologize," I said finally. "Not for something I didn't do." My mother's mouth tightened. "Then don't expect her to forgive you." At that moment, the front door opened. Vanessa stood there, still in yesterday's makeup, her eyes red and wild from crying. She looked at me like I was a stranger. "How dare you?" she said, her voice shaking with fury. "You couldn't let me have one day, could you? Just one." I turned to face her. "You're wrong, Vanessa. I didn't do anything." "I saw you," she hissed. "You and Mark out there on the terrace talking like old friends. He was looking at you like—" Her voice broke. "Like he cared. He was thanking me," I said, trying to stay calm. "His mother." "Oh, stop it!" she shouted. "Stop acting like you're some kind of saint. You've always wanted to take what's mine. You couldn't stand that for once I was the one everyone admired." I stared at her, stunned. "You've always been the one everyone admired, Vanessa." Her laugh was sharp and bitter. "Not last night." Silence filled the room. My parents shifted uneasily, clearly torn between their daughters, but unwilling to admit it. My mother stepped closer to Vanessa, resting a hand on her arm. "Sweetheart, calm down," she murmured, though her eyes flicked toward me with accusation. Vanessa shook her off. "No, she needs to hear this. You think because you wear a lab coat and hide behind your degrees, you're better than me. You think saving one person makes you some kind of saint." I wanted to walk away. I wanted to leave this house, this family, this endless cycle of resentment and denial. But something kept me rooted to the floor. "That's not what this is about," I said quietly. "I've never tried to take anything from you." "Then why does everyone suddenly care about you?" she demanded. "Why was my husband bowing to you in front of all our guests? Because you humiliated me," I said softly. "And he wanted to make it right." Her face twisted with rage. "You're lying. I'm not." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "If you think you can come into my life, into my marriage, and make me look small, you have no idea who you're dealing with." I met her gaze steadily. "I'm not the one who made you look small, Vanessa. You did that to yourself." Her hand lifted as if she might slap me, but she froze, halfway trembling with fury. My mother gasped softly, reaching for her, but Vanessa pulled away and stormed toward the door. That was when Mark appeared in the doorway. He must have heard the shouting because his face was pale, his jaw tight. He looked from Vanessa to me, then to my parents, taking in the scene without a word. "Mark," Vanessa said, her tone instantly changing. "You won't believe what she's saying about us." He didn't respond. He just stood there silent, his gaze fixed on her. For a moment, the air in the room seemed to hold its breath. "Say something," she demanded, her voice cracking. Mark's hands clenched at his sides. I could see the tension in his jaw, the effort it took for him to stay composed. His eyes flicked toward me, then back to her. Finally, in a voice low and controlled, he said, "I've heard enough." And something in the way he said it made the room go still. Even Vanessa stopped, her anger faltering for the first time. My father opened his mouth to speak, but Mark turned away before anyone could stop him. The door shut behind him, with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any of our words. That sound lingered long after Mark had gone sharp and hollow in the air. No one spoke for several seconds. Vanessa stood motionless, her chest rising and falling, her face tight with anger and disbelief. My parents exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. The silence pressed against me until I couldn't bear it anymore. Without a word, I walked past them, grabbed my coat and stepped out into the cold morning light. The door clicked shut behind me, softer this time, but it still felt like an ending. I didn't know where I was going. My car was parked at the curb, the same one I'd driven to the wedding 2 nights before. I sat inside for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, my mind heavy with exhaustion. I didn't want to be part of this mess anymore. All I'd done was exist quietly, and somehow that had been enough to tear everything open. It always was. I drove without thinking, the roads empty and grey, under a low sky. By the time I stopped, I found myself near the same vineyard where the reception had been held. The parking lot was empty except for a single black car near the entrance. As I stepped out, I saw Mark leaning against the hood, hands in his pockets, his tie gone, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I considered turning around, but he looked up and saw me before I could move. "Stephanie," he said, his voice low, "I didn't think you'd come." "I didn't plan to," I admitted, "but I guess I needed air." He nodded toward the open field behind the venue. "Me too." We walked for a while in silence, the grass crunching softly under our feet. The vines stretched in neat rows, stripped bare for winter, their twisted branches stark against the pale horizon. After a while, Mark spoke again. "She thinks I married her for love," he said quietly. "But that's not true. Not entirely." I glanced at him, unsure how to respond. He stopped walking and looked out at the fields. It started as something simple. We met at a fundraiser. She was charming, funny, confident. But then she found out who I was, who my family was, and everything changed. She started talking about events, appearances, connections. It wasn't about us anymore. It was about the image we made together. His tone wasn't bitter, just tired. I listened, sensing how much he'd wanted to say this to someone. "My parents loved her," he continued. "My mother thought she'd bring warmth back into the house. But once she had what she wanted, once the engagement was public, she became someone else. Every conversation was about how things looked. Every decision had to make her shine brighter. And He stopped, running a hand through his hair. I went along with it because it was easier than saying no, because I thought maybe love could grow from that. It didn't. I looked at him, hearing the weight behind his words. "Why didn't you stop it?" He smiled faintly without humour. "Because I didn't want to disappoint anyone. Not her, not my parents, not the people watching. Everyone seemed so sure we were perfect together. And when enough people tell you something, you start to believe it even when it feels wrong." I nodded slowly. "I know that feeling." He turned to me, then his gaze steady. "I saw it last night. The way your family treats you, the way you just take it. Why do you let them?" The question startled me. "Because it's easier than fighting," I said softly. "Because every time I tried to stand up for myself, it just proved them right about me being difficult." Mark was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's not what I saw. What I saw was someone who's been surviving in silence because no one ever gave her the space to speak." His words settled between us, heavy but not painful. I didn't know what to say, so I looked out over the field again. The vines rustled faintly in the wind, their dry leaves whispering like old secrets. "What will you do now?" I asked finally. He took a long breath. "I don't know. I can't keep living like this. Last night made me realise that." "Then don't," I said. "You can still choose honesty even now. It's never too late." He gave a small, tired smile. "That sounds simple when you say it." "It isn't," I admitted, "but it's better than the alternative. Lies rot everything they touch." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable, then nodded. "You're right." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint sound of voices from the road. I turned to see a few people walking toward the venue journalists, judging by their cameras and badges. They must have come to cover the high-profile wedding of the season, unaware that it had already begun to crumble. Mark sighed. "I guess it was only a matter of time before they showed up. They'll want to talk to Vanessa," I said. "Or you," he replied, his tone unreadable. "You're the one they're curious about now." Before I could respond, one of the reporters spotted us. A woman in a red coat lifted her camera, slightly studying me as she approached. Her expression shifted from polite professionalism to sharp recognition. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you—" She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as if to be sure. "Are you Dr. Stephanie Cooper?" The world seemed to pause. Mark looked at me, startled. I felt my throat tighten, unsure how to answer. The woman's voice softened, almost reverent. "The inventor of the cardiac assist device." For a moment, all I could hear was the wind rushing through the vines. I glanced toward the venue, imagining Vanessa inside, still furious, still clinging to the image of perfection she'd built. Then, I looked back at the reporter and nodded once. "Yes," I said quietly. "I am." Her eyes widened. "Would you be willing to answer a few questions? There's been a lot of talk since last night's wedding. People are saying I'm not giving any statements." I interrupted gently. "This isn't the time." She hesitated, then stepped back politely. "Of course, but for what it's worth, Dr. Cooper, it's an honour to meet you." She walked away, but her voice carried back to her colleagues. It's her. It's really her. Mark exhaled slowly beside me, half smiling. Looks like your secret's out. I watched the reporters gathering near the entrance, the glint of cameras catching the light. My chest tightened with a mix of dread and inevitability. Maybe, I said softly, but the truth was bound to surface eventually. Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. It always does. And as the first flash of a camera lit the air, I couldn't help but wonder whether this truth would free me or destroy what little peace I'd built. The truth, it turned out, had its own agenda. Within 48 hours, my name was everywhere. The morning news, science blogs, even lifestyle magazines, all of them carried some version of the same headline: the woman behind the breakthrough, Dr. Stephanie Cooper's silent revolution. I had spent my life keeping my work quiet, hidden behind lab doors and research papers, but the cameras had done what I never intended. They made me visible. At first, it didn't feel real. I sat at my kitchen table sipping coffee, staring at the newspaper as if it were about someone else. My photo, a still from one of the reporter's shots, was printed across the front page. I looked calm, thoughtful, almost confident. But I remembered that moment clearly. I had been terrified. Underneath the headline was a smaller caption: Sister of Socialite, Vanessa Cooper revealed as the scientist responsible for groundbreaking cardiac innovation. That line made my stomach twist. They hadn't written about me alone. They'd tethered my name back to hers like they always did. Even now, when I had finally stepped out of her shadow, the world had found a way to make us a pair again. By the second day, the story had taken on a life of its own. There were videos, interviews, even op-eds debating why a woman like me, quiet, unassuming, had stayed unknown for so long. The reporters called it humility. My mother called it humiliation. She phoned me that afternoon. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity or maybe habit made me pick up. Stephanie, she began, her voice tight and controlled. What is all this? Good afternoon to you too, Mum, I said quietly. Don't start, she snapped. Do you have any idea what people are saying? The phone hasn't stopped ringing. Your father's colleagues are asking questions. The neighbours keep calling. You've embarrassed us again. I blinked, taken aback. Embarrassed you for what? For doing my job, for turning this family into a circus, she said. Do you think it looks good for Vanessa, for her husband? The papers are dragging her name into this. You've made her look small. I didn't write the headlines, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Well, someone had to tell them she accused. You must have. Don't act like this just happened. I let out a shaky laugh, more from disbelief than amusement. You think I called the press? I don't know what to think, she said. But this has to stop. You need to call those reporters and tell them you don't want this attention. I don't control the media, Mum. Then you should have stayed out of sight, she said sharply, like you always used to. The words hit harder than I expected. Like you always used to. That was how she preferred me, silent, invisible, conveniently small. Mum, I said softly, you're angry at the wrong person. I'm angry at the person who ruined her sister's wedding, she said, her voice rising. And now, apparently, her reputation. I closed my eyes. I didn't ruin anything. I didn't ask for any of this. There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something colder, more dangerous. You've always had a way of making yourself the victim, haven't you? That was the moment I realised there was no point arguing. The truth, no matter how clear, was something she'd never see if it didn't fit the story she needed to believe. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said finally. She let out a sharp sigh. You never do what's right for this family, Stephanie. You never have. Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long time before setting it down. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the city outside. I looked around at the space I'd built for myself, simple, neat, full of things that made sense. I had thought the truth would bring peace, but now it only made the noise louder. That evening, my assistant Ben called. Dr. Cooper, congratulations, he said, sounding far more cheerful than I felt. You're trending everywhere. The university wants to schedule interviews. And Channel 8 reached out. They want you on their morning show. Channel 8, I repeated. The one with Rachel Kim. That's the one, he said. They said it'll be a feature on women in science. You'll be the headline guest. I hesitated. I don't know, Ben. I'm not sure I want to make this any bigger than it already is. Honestly, he said gently, it's already big. You might as well tell your side before someone else tells it for you. He wasn't wrong. If there was one thing I'd learned from years in research, it was that silence could be misinterpreted just as easily as speech. Still, the idea of being on camera made my stomach twist. I wasn't built for public attention. I'll think about it, I said. Do, he urged. It's a chance to show people who you really are. And this is important, they said they'd also be interviewing Vanessa. I guess they want both perspectives. I froze. Vanessa, yeah. They said she reached out this morning offering her side of the story about the wedding. Sounds like she's trying to control the narrative. Of course she was. It was exactly what she'd do, turn the story around, paint herself as the misunderstood sister, trying to celebrate her special day while her jealous sibling stole the spotlight. I could already hear her voice smooth and tearful, playing the part she'd perfected since childhood. Are you still there? Ben asked. Yes, I said, forcing calm into my voice. Tell them I'll do it. Really? Yes, I said. If Vanessa's going to talk, then I should be there too. When I hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the dark screen of my phone. The thought of sitting beside Vanessa on live television made my stomach knot, but another feeling, something sharper, steadier, rose beneath the fear. For the first time, I wouldn't let her define me. Not through gossip, not through laughter, not through her version of the truth. I picked up the newspaper again, tracing the headline with my thumb. The woman behind the breakthrough. Maybe, for once, the world would finally see me for who I was, and maybe Vanessa would too. Then, my phone buzzed again, flashing a message from an unknown number. Looking forward to seeing you on TV, Dr. Cooper. Should make for great drama. I didn't need a signature to know who had sent it. I read that message twice, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest return. It was exactly the kind of thing Vanessa would say, half threat, half performance. Still, I refused to let it shake me. The interview wasn't about her. It was about my work, my life, and my chance to tell the truth, without her voice drowning mine out. I had spent 36 years living in the shadows of her spotlight. For once, I would stand in the light on my own terms. The day of the interview came faster than I expected. The studio was in downtown Chicago, sleek and glassy, with cameras that caught every reflection. A young production assistant led me through the maze of hallways to the green room, chatting nervously about how honoured she was to meet me. I smiled and thanked her, though my hands were cold. I'd given hundreds of presentations in my career, some in front of doctors and boards of directors, but nothing like this. When I walked into the makeup room, Vanessa was already there. She sat in front of the mirror, her hair styled in perfect curls, her lipstick bold and red. She didn't look at me immediately, but when she did, her smile was tight and practiced. Well, she said smoothly, if it isn't the star of the show. I didn't realise this was a show, I said, with cameras, lights, and an audience. It's always a show, she replied. You should thank me, you know. If I hadn't invited those guests to the wedding, no one would have known who you were. I met her gaze in the mirror. You're right, I said evenly. You gave me the perfect audience. For a moment, something flickered behind her smile, but she recovered quickly. Let's just keep this civil, shall we? We wouldn't want people to think the famous Dr. Cooper can't handle a little sisterly banter. Before I could answer, the producer entered. We're on in 5. You'll both join Rachel at the desk after the intro. We were ushered into the studio where the lights blazed hot and the set gleamed in soft blues and silvers. The host, Rachel Kim, greeted us warmly, shaking my hand with genuine enthusiasm. Dr. Cooper, she said, it's an honour. Your invention has saved thousands of lives. We're so thrilled to have you here. Thank you, I said quietly, though my pulse was pounding. And of course, Rachel added, turning to Vanessa, we're joined by your sister, Vanessa Cooper. I understand you both were in the headlines recently, after quite an unforgettable wedding. Vanessa laughed lightly, her media-trained charm switching on like a light. Oh, you know how families can be, she said. A little misunderstanding, a lot of love. We've always been close. I felt her words land like a stone in my stomach, but Rachel didn't bite. She turned back to me. Dr. Cooper, if we can start with your work. The public recently learned that you're the lead scientist behind the cardiac assist device now saving lives across the country. Why did you choose to stay anonymous for so long? I took a breath. The cameras were focused on me now, and for the first time I didn't shrink from them. Because the work mattered more than the recognition, I said. Science is collaborative. I didn't invent hope, I just helped make it possible. Rachel smiled. That's a beautiful way to put it. You've been described as humble, dedicated, even selfless. Would you say that comes from your upbringing? Vanessa shifted in her seat, and I could feel her preparing to interrupt. I kept my voice calm. I think it comes from experience. When you grow up being underestimated, you learn that your worth doesn't depend on who sees it. Some lessons come from being overlooked, others from being underestimated. Both can shape you in powerful ways. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. That's quite profound. Vanessa leaned in, her voice honeyed but sharp underneath. Of course, Stephanie's always been modest, she said with a little laugh. Sometimes too modest. I kept telling her she should be more confident. I guess she finally listened. The audience chuckled softly, uncertain whether to laugh or not. I smiled politely. Sometimes confidence doesn't mean speaking louder, I said, meeting her eyes. It means knowing when not to. The host's eyebrows lifted slightly. The studio went quiet for a beat. Then Rachel laughed, softly, expertly steering the conversation. Well said. That humility and strength seem to be what people admire most about you, Dr. Cooper. You've inspired a lot of young women who've struggled to be heard. Vanessa smiled, but I could feel the tension radiating from her. I didn't need to look at her to know what she was thinking, that somehow I'd stolen her stage again. The rest of the interview passed in a blur of questions about my research, my team, my hopes for the device's future. Rachel closed the segment with a warm handshake and words that echoed through the studio. Dr. Stephanie Cooper, a reminder that true brilliance doesn't always seek the spotlight, but sometimes it finds you anyway. The cameras faded. Applause followed. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Rachel leaned closer as the crew began packing up. You handled that beautifully, she said softly. Your grace speaks louder than anything your sister could have said. Thank you, I murmured. I just wanted the truth to be heard. She smiled. It was. As I stood, Vanessa brushed past me, her perfume sharp and familiar. She didn't speak, but her hand brushed against my arm, deliberate cold. Her smile was gone now, replaced by something darker. Outside, the winter light was fading, the city glowing under a grey sky. I walked alone to the waiting car, exhaustion settling deep in my bones. For once, I didn't feel small or unseen. I felt steady. That night back in my apartment, the interview replayed on every major network. My inbox overflowed with messages. Congratulations from colleagues, invitations to speak, offers from universities. The world had seen me finally, and they had seen the truth for what it was. But as the night stretched on and the city lights flickered against my window, my phone buzzed again. A new message, no name attached, but the words were familiar in tone. Enjoy your little moment, Stephanie. You'll regret this. I stared at the screen, the glow lighting my hands, and felt the quiet return of something colder than fear certainty. Vanessa wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. That certainty proved right within a week. The calm that followed the interview was brief, like the stillness before a storm. For a few days, my life filled with quiet praise, emails from colleagues, invitations to speak at conferences, students asking for guidance. It was more attention than I'd ever wanted, but I handled it with careful gratitude. People were kind, respectful, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel something close to peace. But peace, I should have known, was never built to last where Vanessa was concerned. It started on a Wednesday morning. I was at the lab preparing for a meeting with the research board when my assistant Ben rushed in pale and flustered. He held a tablet in his hand. "Dr. Cooper," he said quietly, "you should see this." I took the device and saw the headline immediately. Did Dr. Stephanie Cooper steal her breakthrough? Beneath it was a screenshot of an email supposedly leaked to the press, an anonymous claim that I had taken credit for another researcher's work. The email mentioned falsified data, unethical funding, even the suggestion that my entire project had been built on stolen intellectual property. I read it twice, then looked up at Ben, my throat dry. "Where did this come from?" "No one knows," he said. "The message was sent from a private server to 3 different journalists overnight. It's all over the news now. The company's communications team is trying to contain it." The room tilted slightly as I absorbed the words. It was a lie so perfectly constructed that it almost looked real. The technical language, the dates, even fabricated project logs. Whoever wrote it had done their homework. My stomach sank. I knew exactly who had done it. By that afternoon, the company had issued a statement saying they were reviewing the allegations. The board meeting was postponed. My project access was temporarily suspended pending internal verification. Every polite phrase cut deeper than the last. I could see it in the eyes of my colleagues, the hesitation, the quiet discomfort. They didn't know what to believe. Ben hovered near my office door, looking like he wanted to fix something he couldn't. "Dr. Cooper, this will blow over," he said. "Anyone who's worked with you knows this isn't true." "Maybe," I said softly, "but the damage isn't about truth. It's about noise." I went home early that day, unable to focus. My phone buzzed non-stop, journalists asking for comments, friends sending cautious messages of support. I ignored them all. I didn't need to investigate to know where the leak came from. Vanessa's warning text had been more than petty anger. It had been a promise. I sat at my kitchen table, the news scrolling across the TV. A panel of experts debated whether the accusations might have merit. Words like ethics, transparency, and plagiarism floated through the air, detached from the person they were now attached to. My name. For most of my life, I had lived in silence, dismissed or ignored. Now, for the first time, I was being heard, but for all the wrong reasons. That night, I received a call from Dr. Harlow, my supervisor and head of the research institute. "Stephanie," he said gravely, "I'm sorry. You know how this works. Until this is resolved, we have to suspend the project. It's not a judgment. It's policy." "I understand," I said, though my voice cracked. Off the record, he added, "I don't believe a word of it. But the board needs to see documentation. Proof." "Do you have any?" "I have everything," I said quietly. "Every email, every lab report, every data log. But it won't matter right now. They'll need time. We'll get through this," he promised, though his tone held doubt. After he hung up, I sat in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I should have been angry, but what I felt was colder, measured, deliberate. Vanessa wanted a reaction. She wanted chaos, tears, maybe even a public denial she could twist against me. But I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, I waited. For 3 days, the headlines grew harsher. "Beloved scientist faces scandal. Breakthrough or betrayal." Every article used my photo from the interview, the same calm smile that now looked almost naive. My mother didn't call, but my father did. His tone clipped his loyalty as brittle as ever. "Your mother's been crying all day," he said. "Vanessa says you're refusing to clear things up. Just tell them where the truth is." "I'm working on it," I said. "People are saying terrible things," he continued. "Do you realize what this does to the family's reputation?" There it was. Again, the family's reputation. Never the truth. Never me. "Dad," I said quietly, "I didn't do what they're saying." He hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. "I hope that's true," he said finally. Then he hung up. By Friday morning, the pressure was unbearable. I walked into the lab building just to prove to myself that I still belonged there. Most people avoided eye contact. Ben followed me silently to my office. "They're holding a press conference this afternoon," he said softly. "The company's going to announce the internal review." "Let them," I said. "They'll find nothing." He looked at me, eyes full of worry. "You should defend yourself publicly." I shook my head. "Not yet." It wasn't that I didn't want to. It was that I understood the rhythm of public outrage. The louder you fight, the guiltier you look. If I had learned anything from years of watching Vanessa spin her stories, it was that timing was everything. Late that evening, as I left the building, I saw a black car parked across the street. Mark stepped out before I could pass. He looked tired, his coat collar turned up against the cold. "Stephanie," he said quietly, "I needed to see you." I nodded, unsure what to say. I've been reading everything he said. The emails, the reports, it's all lies. I know it is. I met his eyes, the first flicker of warmth I'd felt all week. "You don't know how much it means to hear that." He nodded. "I think I know who's behind it." "I do too," I said. His jaw tightened. "Vanessa." We stood in silence for a moment. The streetlight flickered above us, cold wind cutting through the quiet. "I'll handle it," I said softly. "No," he said, his voice hardening. "I will." Before I could respond, he turned away, his steps sharp and quick as he disappeared down the street. And though I couldn't hear what he would say next, I could picture it clearly, the look in his eyes, the anger tightening his voice as he confronted her. "What have you done, Vanessa?" That question echoed in my mind for 2 days straight. I didn't need to be there to imagine how that confrontation had gone. I could picture Mark's face tight with disbelief, angry but still searching for the truth. I could imagine Vanessa's her perfect calm cracking as she realised her lies were finally being questioned by someone who mattered. Still, I knew words wouldn't be enough. They never were with her. She was too skilled at twisting them, too used to making herself the victim. I had learned long ago that the only way to fight a lie was with proof, and not just quietly, not in private where she could rewrite the story again. This time, the truth had to be public, undeniable, and final. By Monday morning, I made my decision. I called Dr. Harlow and told him I wanted to hold a press conference. He hesitated at first, warning me that the media could be cruel, that once I stepped into that light, I couldn't control what came next. But control was an illusion I had already lost. If I stay silent, I said they win. And if I speak, at least I do it on my terms. He sighed, then agreed. The company's communications team set everything up for Thursday. Auditorium press invitations live broadcast. When the announcement went out, the buzz was immediate. Dr. Cooper to address allegations. Some headlines questioned whether I'd confess. Others predicted a breakdown. No one expected calm. That morning, as I stood in front of the mirror, I looked at myself carefully. My reflection didn't look like the same woman who had once cried quietly through her sister's wedding. I looked older, steadier, unshakable. I wore a simple charcoal suit and pinned my hair back, no makeup except for lip balm. The truth didn't need decoration. The drive to the conference centre felt endless. Reporters were already gathered outside when I arrived, their cameras flashing even before I stepped from the car. I could hear the voices calling my name, shouting questions. Did you steal your research? Will you resign? Is it true your sister exposed you? The last one made my chest tighten, but I kept walking. Inside, the company staff moved efficiently, ushering me to the stage behind a row of microphones and lights. My presentation slides were already queued, patents design files, timestamp documentation, all ready to be displayed. I glanced toward the front row and froze. Vanessa was there. Dressed in cream, her posture, perfect expression, unreadable. Mark sat beside her, his hands folded, jaw clenched. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I refused to look away. The moderator introduced me, his voice echoing through the hall. Dr. Stephanie Cooper will now respond to the allegations concerning her research integrity. I stepped forward, my pulse steady despite the 100 lenses pointed at me. "Good morning," I began. "A week ago, false accusations were made, suggesting that I stole my work from others. Those claims are not only untrue, they are impossible." I gestured toward the first slide, an image of my initial patent filing dated 7 years prior. "Here is the original design for the cardiac assist device, registered under my name and verified by the US Patent Office. You'll see the date long before any of the supposed collaborators mentioned in the anonymous email were even part of the project." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I clicked to the next slide development notes, handwritten and time-stamped lab entries that matched my own signature and ID code. Every phase of testing was logged, witnessed, and archived under company protocol. These records cannot be altered retroactively. Another slide appeared, a forensic analysis of the so-called leaked email displaying metadata that traced the message back to a personal IP address. I paused, letting the word settle. Independent investigators have confirmed that the email was fabricated. It did not come from any member of the research team. Instead, it was sent from an outside device. Gasps filled the room. Reporters leaned forward, pens frozen in midair. I could feel their anticipation like static. I turned toward Vanessa, then not speaking her name, but letting the silence do it for me. Her face had gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. I continued evenly. "I understand that success often invites scrutiny, but I also believe in accountability, not just for myself, but for anyone who seeks to harm others with lies." The crowd stirred. I could hear the murmurs growing louder, now questions being whispered between reporters. I took a slow breath and looked directly into the cameras. I won't speculate about motives. I won't dignify cruelty with blame. I will only say this truth has its own gravity. It always comes home. I stepped back as the final slide appeared, an official statement from the Patent Office and my company's ethics board, both verifying my ownership of the design and clearing me of any wrongdoing. The moderator thanked the press, but the room had already erupted. Voices overlapped, cameras flashed, hands shot up. One reporter near the front shouted, "Dr. Cooper, are you saying someone close to you was responsible for the forgery?" I didn't answer directly. I simply said, "I'm saying the evidence speaks for itself." My gaze drifted once more toward Vanessa. Her composure was unraveling now, her lips trembling, her breath uneven. Mark had leaned slightly away from her, his expression tight with anger and something like shame. Another reporter's voice rose above the noise. "Dr. Cooper, are you pressing charges?" "No," I said. "Not yet." The flashbulbs lit the room again, capturing the moment in bursts of white. I could see the confusion and fury flickering across Vanessa's face as she stood abruptly, muttering something to a reporter near her row. But the crowd wasn't looking at her anymore. Their attention had shifted. For once, completely and irrevocably, the story was mine. The questions grew louder, overlapping in a blur about the investigation, the forgery, the emotional toll. I answered, calmly, methodically, refusing to be pulled into chaos. Every word, every fact was deliberate. I wanted them to see not a victim, but a woman who had endured and remained steady. By the time it ended, the noise in the room had reached a fever pitch. Reporters clustered around the stage, their voices rising in excitement. "How did you know the email was fake? Who do you think did it? What happens next?" I offered a small measured smile. "The truth has already happened," I said softly. "The rest will follow." As security guided me toward the exit, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. Vanessa was standing near the aisle, trembling, her face pale beneath the harsh lights. The murmurs around her had turned sharp, reporters whispering, cameras focusing. Someone called her name. Then, from somewhere in the crowd came a low boo, followed by another. The sound grew, spreading like a wave through the room, until even she could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. Her perfect posture faltered, her mask slipping at last. And as the doors closed behind me, the sound of the crowd's condemnation echoed faintly down the corridor, an ending I hadn't needed to orchestrate, only to wait for. The echoes of that day followed me everywhere in the days that came after, not in words or noise, but in silence, the kind that fills the air when the truth has finally settled, and everyone realizes there's no more pretending. The press conference had ended the story for me, but for Vanessa, it was only the beginning of her unraveling. By the next morning, social media had already chosen its side. Videos of her standing and trembling under the cameras had gone viral. There were slow-motion clips of her expression, shifting from confidence to panic headlines that called her the sister who lied, and threads dissecting every part of her downfall. It was brutal, ruthless, but it was also inevitable. I hadn't wanted revenge, not in this way. Yet, as I sat in my apartment watching the morning news scroll across the screen, I couldn't bring myself to feel pity. Every network was airing the story Vanessa Cooper exposed for attempted defamation. The woman who once built her world around perfection was now being devoured by the same audience she had spent her life performing for. Her sponsors withdrew their contracts by the end of the day. The charities she represented released statements about re-evaluating partnerships. Her modelling agency dropped her with one terse email that was leaked within hours. By the second evening, even her social media accounts had gone dark. Mark called me that night. His voice was calm, but I could hear the exhaustion beneath it. "It's over," he said simply. "What is?" I asked, though I already knew. "My marriage," he replied. "I filed for divorce this afternoon. The lawyers will handle the rest." I was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "Don't be," he said. "I should have ended it sooner." But I kept thinking she changed, that she'd find some sense of reality again. I didn't realize how far she'd go to protect her image. When I saw those forged emails, I just couldn't do it anymore. There was a long silence on the line. Finally, he added softly, "You didn't deserve any of this, Stephanie." I know, I said, my voice steady, but maybe we both needed to see her clearly. He sighed. "Maybe so." We didn't say much after that. When the call ended, I sat for a while staring at the darkened window, the reflection of the city lights flickering against the glass. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, it was something quieter, deeper. The truth had a strange weight. It didn't lift you up, it just stopped crushing you. The following days blurred together in a strange haze of phone calls, interviews, and apologies from people who had once doubted me, from those who had stayed silent while I was being torn apart. My company reinstated my project, and Dr. Harlow personally called to tell me, "You've handled this with extraordinary grace, Dr. Cooper. The board is proud." I thanked him, though the words felt distant. What I wanted more than recognition was peace, and peace still felt like something just out of reach. By the end of the week, I started hearing rumours about Vanessa's state. Her publicist had quit. Her friends had stopped answering her calls. The last time she was seen, she'd been leaving her apartment building in tears, chased by photographers shouting questions she couldn't answer. And then came Mark's statement. It was released late Friday afternoon, just one sentence long. "After careful thought, I have decided to end my marriage to Vanessa Cooper due to ethical differences." The phrase spread like wildfire. Ethical differences became the headline everywhere. The same publications that once adored her now dissected her every flaw, her arrogance, her lies. It was merciless. I should have turned off the television, but I couldn't. Watching her lose everything felt like staring into a mirror that reflected a life I could have lived if I hadn't chosen silence. We had grown up under the same roof, fed by the same expectations, moulded by the same parents. But somewhere along the way, she'd started believing the lie that love had to be earned through admiration. On Sunday morning, I received a call from my father. His voice was hoarse. "Your mother isn't well," he said. "She's been under a lot of stress. Can you come?" I hesitated. It had been weeks since I'd spoken to either of them, but something in his tone made me go. When I arrived, the house felt different, dimmer, smaller. My father met me at the door looking older than I remembered. He led me to the living room where my mother sat on the sofa wrapped in a shawl. She looked frail, her eyes distant. "Mum," I said softly, kneeling beside her. "How are you feeling?" She looked at me slowly, her gaze unfocused. I didn't know she whispered, didn't know what I asked. About her, she murmured, about what she did. I thought she was strong. I thought I raised her to be good. Her hand trembled as she reached for mine. I wanted to protect her, both of you. I thought if I pushed you harder, you'd be safe. But I was wrong. Her voice cracked. You were the strong one, Stephanie. Always the strong one. And I just didn't see it. I didn't know how to respond. The words I'd wanted to hear all my life came too late, but they still pierced me. I squeezed her hand gently. "It's over now," I said. "You don't have to worry." She nodded faintly, but her expression shifted, something urgent flickering in her eyes. She tried to speak again, her lips forming words that came out barely as breath. "There's something you must know," she whispered. "Mum." I leaned closer, but her hand slipped from mine. "Dad." I called out, panic rising. He rushed in, eyes wide, as she slumped back against the sofa, her face pale. "Helen!" he shouted, gripping her shoulders. We called for an ambulance, but as I waited, her words repeated in my head, faint and incomplete. "There's something you must know." I stared at her motionless form, my pulse pounding in my ears, and for the first time since all of this began, a chill of dread crept through me. Whatever she had meant to say, whatever truth she carried, it wasn't about Vanessa. It was about me. That night, the hospital room hummed softly, with the rhythmic beeping of machines. My mother lay pale and still against the white sheets, her breathing shallow, her hands frail and trembling. The doctors said she'd collapsed from exhaustion and stress, but I knew it was more than that. Years of silence, years of pretending, years of secrets finally pressing too hard against her heart. My father sat beside her bed, shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up. I stood by the window watching the snow fall against the dark glass. The world outside looked peaceful, but the air in the room was thick with things unsaid. My mother had always been a woman of control, poised, decisive, never uncertain. Seeing her so fragile, whispering about something I must know, filled me with a quiet dread I couldn't name. When her eyes opened, they went straight to me. There was no hesitation this time, no pretense, just raw, unfiltered truth staring back. "Stephanie," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I turned, stepping closer. "I'm here, Mum." She motioned weakly toward the chair. "Sit, please." I did. The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the soft hum of the machines. Finally she spoke. "There's something I should have told you long ago. Something I thought I could bury." I waited, heart pounding, but said nothing. "When I was young, before I married your father, I was in love," she said slowly. "His name was Robert Hale. He was kind, thoughtful, the sort of man who made you feel seen. We planned a life together. But then he was offered a position overseas, and I stayed behind. I thought it was the end." Her voice trembled. "Months later, I found out I was pregnant. With you." The words didn't sink in at first. I blinked, thinking I must have misheard it. "What?" She looked at me, with tears in her eyes. "Your father isn't your biological father, Stephanie. He knew I was expecting when he married me. He said he could forgive it, that we could raise you together, pretend it never happened. But he never really did. And I let him turn that resentment into something he aimed at you." I stared at her, my throat tightening, my voice barely working. "You let him treat me like that?" She nodded weakly. "I was afraid of losing him, afraid of losing the life we built. He loved Vanessa from the moment she was born. She was his, fully his. You were a reminder of everything I'd done wrong." A cold, hollow ache spread through me, not anger, not yet just the shattering realization that every cruelty, every cold word, every dismissal had been born from this secret. So all those years, I said quietly, you both punished me for something I didn't even know. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I told myself it was to protect you, that if we kept the truth buried, it would save you from scandal, from being labelled. But it was cowardice. I see that now. I stood up, turning away before the flood of emotion inside me could break through. My hands trembled, my breath uneven. You let me believe I was the disappointment, I said softly. You let me think it was my fault. Her voice cracked. I know. And I am so sorry, Stephanie. I can't undo what I did, but I need you to know the truth before it's too late. I looked at her, then really looked. She was no longer the woman who ruled our home with quiet judgment. She was just human, broken, regretful, fragile. I felt something shift in me, a strange mixture of pain and pity. Why now? I asked. Why tell me after all this time? Because she said, her eyes glistening. You deserve peace, you always did, and I was too proud to give it to you. A quiet knock came at the door. My father entered, his face lined with fatigue. He looked from me to her, clearly aware of what had been said. He didn't speak at first. When he did, his voice was low, trembling slightly. She's telling you the truth. I turned to face him. You knew. He nodded. From the beginning. I thought I could forgive it, but I didn't. Every time I looked at you, I saw another man, and I took that out on you. The words hit like stones, but they weren't surprising. They only confirmed what I had felt my entire life, but never understood. I don't hate you, I said quietly, either of you, but I can't pretend this didn't shape me. He nodded, shame shadowing his face. I know, and I'll carry that guilt until I'm gone. The room fell silent again, heavy with decades of damage that could never truly be repaired. I sat back down, exhausted beyond words. What happened to him? I asked. To Robert Hale. My mother's eyes softened. He died when you were 7. He never knew you existed. I thought keeping you a secret was protecting everyone. I realize now it only destroyed us. I pressed my lips together, unable to speak. There was no comfort to give her, and none to take. Hours passed before I left the hospital. Snow was falling harder now, coating the streets in soft white. I walked slowly toward the parking lot, the cold air biting my skin. I didn't cry. The truth had come too late for tears. When I reached my car, I found Vanessa waiting by the entrance. She looked different, smaller somehow, her makeup gone, her eyes swollen from crying. She approached me, hesitantly, her voice trembling. I heard she said, "Dad told me." I froze, unsure what to say. She took a step closer. All this time I thought you were the one who didn't belong, the outsider. But it was me. You were the real daughter all along. Her voice broke on the last word. I looked at her. The sister who had tormented me envied me, and now stood before me broken by the same truth that had shattered me. And for the first time in our lives, I saw her not as my rival, but as another casualty of the same lie. I didn't answer. I just let the silence between us stretch heavy, fragile and finally honest. That silence stayed with me for days. It followed me home into my dreams and into the quiet spaces of my apartment, where the air itself seemed to hum with everything I had learned. My mother was still in the hospital, recovering. My father hardly spoke when I visited, and Vanessa had gone somewhere I didn't ask about. The house we'd grown up in, the stage for every quiet wound, now felt like a monument to all the words we had never said. I told myself I was done looking back. The truth was out, and though it left me hollow, it had also freed me. But closure, I learned, doesn't always come in the moment truth is spoken. Sometimes it lingers in the smallest things, an unfinished thought, a hidden drawer, a letter that never reached its destination. 3 days after that conversation outside the hospital, I returned to my parents' house. My father was out running errands, and the house was still and dim. It smelled faintly of lavender and medicine. I told myself I was there to gather a few things for my mother, a change of clothes, some of her favourite books. But when I walked into her room, something drew me to her desk. It was an old wooden thing, the same one she'd had since I was a child, covered in neatly stacked papers and old envelopes. Everything about it was perfectly ordered, as though she'd been trying to keep her life arranged, even as it fell apart. As I opened one of the smaller drawers, I noticed an envelope tucked beneath a stack of receipts. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, and my name was written across the front in her delicate handwriting, Stephanie. For a long time, I didn't move. My first instinct was to put it back. The idea of reading anything she had kept hidden for years filled me with a strange dread, but curiosity, or maybe something deeper, made my hands tremble as I lifted it out. The seal was unbroken. She had written it, but never sent it. I sat on the edge of her bed and opened it carefully. The letter began simply, "My dearest Stephanie, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to tell you what I should have told you every day of your life, that I loved you even when I couldn't show it, even when I failed you in ways I can never undo." My throat tightened as I read. The words flowed with the kind of softness I had never heard in her voice before. "You were my first miracle. I used to watch you sleep and wonder how something so perfect could come from such a mistake. But it wasn't you who was the mistake, it was me. My fear, my silence, my pride. I let them build a wall between us, and I let your father's resentment become our truth. I thought I was protecting you by keeping the secret. But I see now that I was protecting myself. From judgment, from shame, from losing control." My eyes blurred as the lines wavered before me. "You were always different, not because of who your father was, but because of who you were. You carried something pure, something I could never touch without feeling unworthy. When you smiled, I saw the man I loved and lost, and I hated myself for it. So instead of holding you, I pushed you away. I told myself you didn't need me, but you did, and I wasn't there." A tear slipped down my cheek, falling onto the paper. I wiped it quickly, terrified of ruining the ink. Every time I saw you shrink under our words, every time I watched you sit quietly at the table while the rest of us laughed, I wanted to reach across the space and tell you the truth. But then the moment would pass, and I'd tell myself, tomorrow. There were so many tomorrows that never came. My hands trembled as I turned the page. "You must know this nothing about your life was an accident. You are exactly what I hoped for when I thought I'd lost everything. You are the proof that love, even broken, can create something good. You were never, less never, second, never unwanted. You were the part of my heart I buried to keep the rest of me alive." I stopped reading for a moment, pressing the letter to my chest. I could almost hear her voice in the room, with me, not the cold, clipped tone I'd grown used to, but the one I'd always imagined when I was a little girl, pretending she cared. The voice that said, "You're enough," even if it never reached my ears. The last paragraph was shorter, but every word felt carved into the page. "If I never say this aloud, I need you to believe it anyway. I am proud of you. I always was. Forgive me for not being the mother you needed. I hope one day you'll understand that my silence wasn't indifference. It was weakness, and I pray that you'll never let silence steal your love the way it stole mine. With all my heart, Mum." I sat there for a long time, staring at the letter. The edges of the paper trembled slightly in my hands, and my chest ached in a way that wasn't anger or sorrow, something in between. The house was quiet, except for the soft creak of the floor and the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. All my life I had wanted an explanation. I thought if I could just understand why she treated me the way she did, I could finally let go. But now that I had it, I didn't feel release. I felt the weight of generations of silence pressing down on me, hers, mine, all the things we had never said. I folded the letter gently, smoothing the creases, and placed it back into its envelope. Then I stood, walked to her nightstand, and set it beside the photo of our family. For a moment, I looked at the picture. Vanessa's perfect smile, my father's proud stance, my mother's controlled poise, and me slightly off to the side. The only one who didn't seem to fit until now. I brushed my fingers over the frame and whispered into the quiet room, "I understand now." And for the first time, I meant it. The morning after I found my mother's letter, I woke to a world that felt oddly still. The winter sun was pale and soft against the curtains, and for a moment I lay there listening to the silence. It wasn't the heavy kind anymore, the silence I'd grown up with, thick with judgment and things unsaid. This was gentler, a quiet that came not from absence, but from peace. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like calm. My mother was still in the hospital recovering slowly, and though the truth had shaken everything we thought we were as a family, it had also brought a strange sort of clarity. The masks had fallen away. The pretense was gone. What was left was painful, but real. I went to see her that afternoon. When I entered her room, she was sitting up, her eyes clearer than they had been in days. The letter I'd found lay folded neatly on her bedside table. She must have realised I'd discovered it. "You read it?" she said softly. "I did. Do you hate me for it?" I shook my head. "No. I think I finally understand you." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she smiled faintly. "That's more grace than I deserve." We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. For once, being there was enough. When I left, I kissed her forehead and said, "Rest now." She nodded, and I thought there would be more time. 2 nights later, she was gone. The call came just before dawn. My father's voice was small, broken in a way I'd never heard. "She passed in her sleep," he said, peacefully. I sat in bed for a long while after hanging up, staring at the pale light creeping through the window. My chest felt hollow, but not with anger or regret, just the ache of knowing something had ended for good. The funeral was small, quiet, just family and a few friends. Vanessa didn't come. No one had seen her in weeks. Some said she'd left the city. Others whispered she was in a clinic somewhere, away from the cameras and the noise. I didn't know, and for the first time, I didn't try to find out. Mark came to the service. He stood at a respectful distance until, after the crowd thinned, then approached me beneath the grey sky. He looked older, the strain of everything visible in the lines of his face. "I wanted to offer my condolences," he said. "And an apology." I looked at him, unsure what he meant. For not seeing the truth sooner, he continued. "For believing things I should have questioned. You didn't deserve any of it." I nodded slowly. "We all see what we want to until we can't anymore." He gave a small, sad smile. "You always had more strength than anyone realised." "Not strength," I said quietly. "Just endurance." He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and handed me a folded card. "My mother wanted to write you. She couldn't stop talking about what your work did for her. She called you her miracle." I took the card, my throat tightening. She didn't need to. "Knowing she's well is enough." "She said you'd say that," he replied gently. "But she wanted you to have it anyway." He gave me a final nod and walked away before I could say anything more. I watched him go, the snow beginning to fall again, soft flakes settling on his dark coat, until he disappeared from view. After the funeral, the world moved on, but I didn't rush to keep up. My company offered to fast-track my promotion to make me the public face of a new global research initiative. It was everything I had once thought I wanted, but the thought of stepping back into that spotlight made me feel tired. I thanked them politely and declined. For now, I told them I need a different kind of work. Instead, I took a small teaching position at a nearby university. I wanted quiet halls, curious students, the rhythm of something simple. I spent my days lecturing about medical ethics, about the balance between innovation and humility lessons I had learned in ways no textbook could teach. Some of my colleagues thought I was wasting potential, that I was stepping down instead of up. But they didn't understand. After years of climbing, I had finally reached a place where I could rest. The days passed gently. I found comfort in the ordinary, the sound of chalk against the board, the laughter of students, the feeling of snow melting on my coat as I walked home each evening. There was grief, of course, but it softened with time, turning into something quieter, almost tender. One evening, about 2 months after the funeral, I returned home to find an envelope slipped under my door. It was small, cream-coloured and unmarked, No sender, no address. Just 2 words written neatly across the front in ink that had smudged slightly. Forgive me. I froze the letter trembling in my hand. My heart began to race, not in fear but in recognition. The handwriting was unmistakable. Vanessa. For a long moment, I just stood there in the quiet hallway, the paper soft against my fingers. Outside, the wind whispered against the windows, carrying the faintest echo of something I couldn't quite name. I turned the envelope over. There was no seal, just a flap tucked in neatly, as though whoever had left it couldn't quite decide whether to close it completely. Part of me wanted to open it immediately, to know finally what she had to say after all this time. But another part hesitated, knowing that whatever was inside could unravel the fragile piece I had just begun to build. I sat down at my kitchen table, staring at it under the lamplight. The words on the front seemed to pulse softly in the glow. Forgive me. I didn't know yet if I could, but I knew I would have to read it. I reached for the flap, my hand trembling slightly, and whispered to the empty room. All right, Vanessa. Let's see what you have left to say. I opened the envelope slowly, careful not to tear the edges. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly in thirds. I unfolded it, the faint scent of perfume, one I recognised from years ago drifting out. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, looping elegant, but shakier than I remembered. I drew in a breath and began to read. Stephanie. If you're reading this, it means I finally found enough courage to stop hiding from the person I hurt most. I've tried to write this so many times before, but every word sounded smaller than the damage I caused. There isn't a way to make it right, but I can tell the truth. The real one, not the kind I used to tell the world. My chest tightened as I read. The letter continued in the same shaky hand, the ink uneven where it had blotted. When everything fell apart, the sponsors, the marriage, the reputation, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. But it wasn't until the silence came that I realised what I'd really lost. You. I spent my life chasing your reflection, even when I didn't understand why. You had something I wanted so badly, something I thought I could fake if I smiled brightly enough. It wasn't money or success or even approval, it was respect. You earned it by living quietly, by working for something real. I tried to steal it by pretending. And when that didn't work, I tried to destroy the one person who had it just so I wouldn't feel so small. My eyes blurred and I had to stop reading for a moment. I set the paper down, pressing my palms against the table to steady myself. The words were raw, stripped of her usual charm. It was the voice of someone who had finally stopped performing. I picked the letter back up. I thought winning meant being seen. I thought love was applause. But every time the world clapped for me, it only made the quiet louder when I went home. You never needed people to tell you who you were, and I hated you for that. I told myself it was jealousy, but it was envy mixed with shame. I used to think you were weak because you didn't fight back. Now I see that I was the weak one because I couldn't stop fighting everyone, especially you. I wiped a tear from my cheek, feeling the weight of years collapsing into the space between us. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I need you to know I see it all now, the way I treated you, the lies I told, the things I took from you that can't be given back. I've lost the life I built on pretending. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe I'm finally becoming someone honest. I paused again, my vision swimming. The next line was shorter, but it broke something open inside me. You were the mirror I refused to look into because I was afraid of seeing who I really was. A sob caught in my throat. I set the letter down, covering my face with my hands. For years I had imagined what remorse from her might look like. I thought it would feel vindicating, like justice. But reading these words didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me ache. For both of us. When I could breathe again, I picked it back up and read the final lines. I'm leaving the city. I don't know where I'm going yet, but I need to start over somewhere no one knows my name. Maybe someday, if you ever want to find me, you will. And if you do, I'll be waiting not as the sister who hurt you, but as the woman trying to become worthy of your forgiveness. Vanessa. By the time I reached her name, the tears had soaked the bottom of the page. I folded the letter, carefully smoothing the creases, and sat back in my chair. The room felt impossibly still, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the quiet. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to make her see me, trying to earn something she had never been able to give. And now, here it was, not admiration, not even an apology I could hold on to, but something more fragile. Honesty. For the first time in my life, I saw her clearly, not the version she tried to be for the world, but the lost, frightened girl underneath it all. And I realised something I hadn't expected. I missed her. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the letter on the table, and whispered into the empty room, "You're still my sister." The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Every place I went, every face I passed, I caught myself wondering where she might be. The city felt bigger, somehow emptier, as if she had taken part of its noise with her when she left. After a few days, I decided to find her, not to confront her, not to reopen old wounds, but simply to see for myself that she was still out there breathing, living, trying. I didn't know where to start, but I began with the last address I knew. Her apartment building looked the same as before, but her name was gone from the mailbox. The landlord, a kind man with greying hair, recognised me immediately. "You're her sister," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Do you know where she went?" He nodded slowly. "She left a month ago, said she needed a change. Paid off the lease early, gave away most of her things. I think she wanted to disappear." "Did she say where she was going?" He hesitated, thinking. "She mentioned Oregon, I think. Some small town near the coast. Said she wanted to work with people, something about helping others start over." My breath caught. "Oregon." "That's what she said," he confirmed. She looked different, tired but lighter somehow, like she'd stopped running. I thanked him and walked back to my car, clutching the edge of the letter still tucked in my coat pocket. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of rain. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the grey sky, and felt the pull of something I hadn't felt in years. Not revenge, not guilt. Hope. I didn't know what I would say if I found her, or if she'd even want to see me, but I knew I had to try. As I started the car, I glanced at the folded letter on the passenger seat and whispered, "All right, Vanessa, let's begin again." The drive to Oregon took 2 days. I didn't rush. The road stretched endlessly through mountains and fields, the world around me painted in shades of grey and green. Every mile felt like a slow unwinding of memory, of anger, of the walls I'd built around myself. The letter sat beside me the whole way, its presence like a heartbeat I could feel even in the quietest moments. I stopped in small towns for coffee and gas, watching people pass by with the kind of ease that comes from never being known beyond their neighbourhood. That was what Vanessa had wanted, I realised. A place where no one expected anything from her. A place she could start over. By the time I reached the Oregon coast, the afternoon sky was streaked with pale gold and lavender. The air smelled of salt and cedar, and gulls drifted lazily above the water. I had an address scribbled on a scrap of paper, a community centre in a town called Haven Point. The landlord back in the city had remembered her mentioning it. She said she was volunteering there, he told me. Something to do with helping the homeless. I found the building easily. It sat near the edge of town, a modest structure with a hand-painted sign that read, Haven Outreach Centre. A small garden grew out front, bright with winter pansies and daffodils that had no business blooming this early in the season. The sound of laughter drifted through the open doorway. Warm, genuine laughter that made me pause before stepping inside. The interior was simple but full of life. Folding tables lined with boxes of canned food shelves, stacked with blankets and a bulletin board covered in handwritten notes of gratitude. A few volunteers were sorting supplies near the back. One of them, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, noticed me and smiled. "Can I help you?" she asked, brushing flour from her apron. "I'm looking for someone," I said. "Her name's Vanessa. Vanessa Cooper." Her expression softened and a knowing look crossed her face. "Ah, You must be Stephanie." I blinked in surprise. "You know who I am?" She nodded. "She talks about you sometimes. Not much, but enough that we all know you're important to her." I exhaled, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly. "Is she here?" "She's in the back," the woman said, pointing toward a hallway. "We're serving dinner tonight." "She's probably in the kitchen. You'll hear her before you see her. She laughs like she's been waiting her whole life to." Her words hit me in a place I hadn't realized was still tender. I smiled faintly. "Thank you." As I walked down the hall, the sound of laughter grew clearer, low, warm-threaded with the kind of ease I had never associated with Vanessa. The smell of soup and bread filled the air, comforting and homey. My heart began to race. I wasn't sure what I would say when I saw her. There were no rehearsed words, no prepared apology or speech, just the letter in my bag and the weight of everything we had both lost. I stopped outside the kitchen doorway. Through the narrow opening, I saw her. Vanessa stood at the counter wearing jeans and a plain blue sweater, her hair tied back loosely. She was ladling soup into bowls, laughing at something a young volunteer said beside her. Her face was different, softer somehow. The tension that had always lived in her posture, the constant need to perform, was gone. She moved easily, without the rigid grace she'd once worn like armour. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The years between us felt both endless and non-existent. I wanted to step forward to call her name, but something held me still, the quiet fear that maybe she didn't want to be found after all. The boy she'd been talking to left the kitchen, carrying a tray of food. She stayed behind, humming softly as she wiped the counter. I took a slow breath and stepped closer. The floor creaked beneath my shoes, just enough for her to hear. She turned her head slightly, frowning in mild confusion. Then slowly she turned all the way around. Her eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Her hand froze midair, still holding the dish towel. Then she blinked, her lips parting, as if to make sure what she saw was real. "Steph." My name came out as a whisper, fragile and disbelieving. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. Her eyes filled with tears that shimmered in the soft kitchen light. "You found me," she said finally, her voice trembling between wonder and guilt. "I did," I managed to say. The distance between us felt like a decade compressed into a single step. I wanted to rush to her to close the gap, but something inside me said to wait, to let her make the next move. She set the towel down, her hand shaking. "I didn't think you would. I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again after everything I did." "I wasn't sure I did," I admitted. "But then, I got your letter." She closed her eyes briefly and a single tear slipped down her cheek. "I didn't think you'd read it." "I read it," I said softly, every word. The kitchen fell silent. The sounds of chatter and clinking dishes from the main room seemed far away, as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. Finally, she took another step forward. "You came all this way," she whispered. "I needed to see for myself," I said. "To know you were all right." She laughed softly through her tears. "All right, I don't know about that, but I'm trying, and for the first time that feels like enough." Her voice broke on the last word. She looked at me, then really looked at me, the way people do when they're seeing someone they thought they'd lost forever. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, she took a trembling breath and said, "Steph, I don't know if I can ever make it right, but I'm so sorry." I felt my own tears finally spill over. "We don't have to make it right," I said quietly. "We just have to start again." She smiled then, small, uncertain, but real. It was the same smile she used to have when we were little, before everything got complicated. I stepped closer, the distance between us nearly gone, and whispered, "Hi, Vanessa." She let out a shaky laugh, brushing at her tears. "Hi, Steph." And then, for the first time in our lives, we stood face to face, not as rivals or strangers, but as sisters who had finally found their way back to each other. For a long moment after the sat, neither of us spoke. We just stood there in the soft light of the kitchen, surrounded by the quiet clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation coming from the hall beyond. It felt as if the world had paused for us, holding its breath. My chest ached with everything I wanted to say and everything I no longer needed to. Vanessa took a step forward, her hands trembling slightly. Her eyes were red and wet, but she didn't look away this time. For once, there was no pride, no pretense, no mask between us. Just the rawness of two lives that had broken in different ways and somehow found their way back to the same moment. "I don't even know where to start," she whispered. "Then don't," I said softly. "We don't have to." She gave a shaky laugh that turned into a sob. "I hurt you so much, Steph. For years I did everything I could to make you feel small. I thought if I could keep you beneath me, then I'd never have to face how little I was inside." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. I stepped closer, shaking my head. "Vanessa," I said gently, "we both hurt. Just in different ways." She looked at me, searching my face as though she was still trying to believe I was real. "I wanted your life," she said finally, her words trembling. "Not your job, or your success, or the attention you got after everything came out. I wanted the peace you carried, the kind of respect people gave you without you ever asking for it. I thought if I could take everything you had, I'd finally feel whole." I felt my throat tighten. "And did you?" She let out a small broken laugh. "No, it nearly destroyed me." I reached for her then, my hand brushing her arm. "Peace isn't something you take," I said quietly. "It's something you earn by letting go." Her eyes met mine again, and for the first time I saw no anger there, only grief and something that looked a lot like understanding. "I didn't know how to let go," she whispered. "All I ever knew was how to hold on to things, even the wrong things until they broke me. Fame, attention, lies, even hatred. I held on to hating you because it was the only way I knew how to feel powerful." I swallowed hard. "And now?" She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling. "Now I just want to feel free." I nodded, my own tears spilling over. "Then, let's start there." For a long moment, we stood in silence again. Then, she moved closer, hesitated only for a heartbeat, and wrapped her arms around me. I felt her shake against me, her tears wet against my shoulder, and before I knew it, I was crying too. Years of pain, jealousy, resentment, they all seemed to dissolve in that embrace. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, not yet, but it was something just as powerful, surrender. She clung to me tightly, her breath hitching. "I thought I'd never earn this," she whispered. "There's nothing left to earn," I murmured. "We're just us now." Her grip tightened briefly before she pulled back to look at me. "How do we even begin to make up for all of it?" "We don't," I said simply. "We just live differently now." She nodded slowly, her face streaked with tears, but calmer than I'd ever seen it. "You really forgive me, I'm trying," I said honestly. "And maybe that's enough for today." She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth trembling. "It's more than I deserve." "Maybe," I said. "But it's exactly what we both need." We stood like that for a while, not speaking, just breathing in the quiet that had once divided us and now somehow bound us. The kitchen noises slowly returned around us, the clang of pans, the hum of the dishwasher, the muffled laughter of volunteers in the next room, but they felt distant, almost unreal. After a while, Vanessa wiped her face and gestured toward the back door. "Come on," she said softly. "There's a bench outside overlooking the water. I sit there after the shifts sometimes. It helps." I followed her out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and sea salt. The sun was dipping low, spilling gold across the water. We sat together on the wooden bench, the silence between us comfortable this time. "I didn't think I'd ever see the ocean again," Vanessa said after a while. "When everything fell apart, I thought my life was over. But here, these people don't care about who I was. They just care about what I can do now. I cook, I clean, I listen. Sometimes that's enough." I turned to look at her. There was a peace in her expression I had never seen before. "You found something real," I said. She smiled faintly, maybe for the first time. The wind picked up slightly, tossing a strand of her hair across her face. She brushed it away and looked at me, her gaze steady. I know it doesn't erase what I did, but I want you to know, Steph, that I'm proud of you. Always was. Even when I couldn't stand you, I was proud. You became everything I couldn't. I shook my head. No, I said quietly. I just became who I had to. And now, maybe you can too. Her eyes shimmered again, but this time she didn't cry. She just nodded, the smallest smile touching her lips. Maybe we both can. We sat there as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky burning orange and pink before fading into soft grey. For once there was nothing left to fix, nothing left to prove. Just two women sitting side by side, finally at peace, with the pieces of themselves they could never quite put together before. The world felt still again, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we could start over, not as who we were, but as who we had become. Then, from somewhere behind us, I heard the sound of small footsteps pounding against the pavement. Vanessa, a young voice called, full of laughter. We both turned as a little boy came running toward us. His hair tousled his cheeks, flushed from the cold. He was maybe 6 or 7, carrying a paper cup of hot chocolate that sloshed with each step. He skidded to a stop beside Vanessa, grinning. I saved you some, he announced proudly, holding out the cup. Vanessa laughed softly, ruffling his hair. You're a sweetheart, Tommy. Thank you. The boy turned toward me, then his eyes wide and curious. Who's that? Vanessa hesitated for a moment, glancing at me. Then she smiled. That, she said gently, is my sister. The boy's eyes lit up. Oh, your Auntie Steph. For a heartbeat, I couldn't speak. I blinked, caught between surprise and an ache so tender it almost hurt. I looked at Vanessa, who was smiling through fresh tears. Yes, I said finally, my voice soft but sure. I guess I am. The words lingered in the air, quiet and certain, like a thread tying the past to the present. Vanessa smiled through her tears, her arms still around the boy, and for a long moment I just watched them. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the last light of day clung to the edges of the sky. The laughter of children echoed faintly from somewhere down the street, and I felt something in my chest I hadn't felt in years, something that felt like belonging. That night, after everyone had gone home, Vanessa and I sat together in the empty community centre, sipping lukewarm tea and talking, until the stars had faded into morning. For the first time in our lives, there were no accusations, no comparisons, no defences, just two sisters piecing together what was left. She told me about her new life, the people she helped, the small apartment she rented near the cliffs, the peace she had found in work that had nothing to do with being seen. When dawn began to stretch across the windows, she said quietly, Steph, I've been thinking it's time we went home. The word home sat heavy between us. For both of us, it meant a place full of ghosts, but maybe it was time to face them. I nodded slowly. Dad, she nodded. He's alone now. I think he needs to see us. Both of us. The drive back was quiet. The road wound through forests and fields, the air heavy with the scent of pine. Vanessa drove while I watched the landscape roll past. She looked older, wiser, no longer the image-obsessed woman she once was. There was still fragility in her, but also strength born from humility. I realised then that forgiveness wasn't something you granted once. It was something you chose again and again, every time you looked at someone and saw who they were becoming instead of who they had been. When we reached our childhood home, the old house looked smaller, almost fragile against the grey sky. The paint was chipped, the garden overgrown, and the air held that same faint scent of lavender our mother had loved. The front door creaked when we opened it, and the sound echoed through the empty halls like a memory. Our father was in the living room, sitting in the old recliner near the window. He turned when he heard our footsteps, and for a moment, he just stared. His face had aged in ways that startled me deeper, lines, thinner hair, and a tiredness that went beyond the body. Then, without a word, he stood. Dad. Vanessa said softly. He took one unsteady step forward, then another. His voice cracked as he spoke. Both of you. He reached for us, his eyes glistening. I never thought I'd see this day. Vanessa moved first, stepping into his arms, and I followed a heartbeat later. For a moment, the three of us stood there in silence, holding each other, and it felt like time itself had stopped. His shoulders shook as he cried softly against us. I failed both, my girls, he said, his voice trembling. All those years, I thought I was protecting what was left of our family, but all I did was break it more. Vanessa pulled back slightly, her hand still on his arm. We all broke it, Dad, she said gently, but we can still put it back together. He nodded, his gaze flicking between us. Your mother would have wanted this, he whispered. The mention of her name sent a ripple through the room. For years, her presence had been a weight none of us knew how to carry. But now, somehow the grief felt lighter, like her absence had made space for something else. We spent the afternoon together, tidying up the house, cooking a simple meal the way we used to when we were younger. Vanessa insisted on making her soup the same one she'd been serving at the community centre. The smell filled the kitchen, familiar and comforting. When we sat down to eat, the table felt different, not just because one chair was empty, but because the silence was no longer sharp. It was peaceful. My father ate slowly occasionally, reaching for Vanessa's hand, then mine. This feels like a dream, he said quietly. It doesn't have to be, I replied. We can keep it this way. He smiled faintly. Maybe I don't have much time left, he said, but seeing you both here like this, it's more than I deserve. Vanessa reached across the table, touching his hand gently. It's not about deserving, Dad. It's about forgiving. His eyes glistened again, and he nodded slowly. You sound like your mother, he murmured. We finished dinner in soft conversation, sharing stories of the past, not the painful ones, but the simple moments we had forgotten. The way Mum used to hum while she cooked, the time Vanessa tried to teach me to dance in the living room, and we broke the lamp. The night we all sat by the fire during a storm, pretending the thunder was applause. For the first time in years, we laughed together. Real laughter. And it felt like the house itself exhaled. When the plates were cleared and the candles had burned low, my father leaned back in his chair, looking at us both, with eyes full of something I hadn't seen in him since I was a child, peace. He reached out, taking each of our hands in his. His palms were warm and rough, the hands of a man who had lived too long with guilt. Promise me something, he said quietly. We both looked at him. Anything, I said. He squeezed our hands gently, his voice trembling. Promise me. You'll stay together. No more years apart, no more silence. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears again, and she nodded. We promise, Dad. I felt my throat tighten as I said, always. He smiled then, a small, weary smile that seemed to carry every regret and every bit of love he had left. Good, he whispered. That's all I need. We sat like that for a while, the three of us holding hands, across the table, the candlelight flickering softly between us. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender from the garden. For the first time, the house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt alive. As the night deepened, my father's head began to nod with fatigue. Vanessa and I helped him to his chair by the window, where he settled in with a contented sigh. He looked up at us one last time, his eyes soft with gratitude. You girls, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You made it home. Vanessa squeezed his hand, her voice gentle. We're not going anywhere again. He smiled faintly, closing his eyes. Good, he murmured. Just stay together. The last words hung in the air soft and steady as the room fell into a deep, peaceful quiet. For several long moments after those words, none of us moved. The silence stretched and settled around us like a soft blanket. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old wall clock, a sound that suddenly felt louder than it had in years. I remember the way the candlelight flickered across my father's face, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, slowing until it stopped completely. There was no struggle, no fear, just stillness, just peace. Steph. Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling as she leaned closer. Her hand was still holding his. He's not breathing. I reached out instinctively, touching his wrist. His skin was warm but unmoving. I waited for a pulse that never came, even though part of me already knew. My throat tightened, and for a few seconds I couldn't find my voice. Then softly I said the words I had dreaded and somehow expected all my life. He's gone. Vanessa's sob broke through the stillness. She folded into me, clutching my arm as she cried. I held her, letting my own tears fall silently. The man who had once seemed unshakable, whose approval we had both chased in our own ways, was gone. Yet the grief that filled the room wasn't sharp or bitter. It was quiet, tender, like the closing of a long, painful chapter that had finally found its last sentence. We stayed like that for a while until the candles burned down to pools of wax. Neither of us spoke. The house, which had once been filled with so much tension, now felt weightless. I could almost hear my mother's voice in the stillness, whispering through the walls, telling us to be kind to each other. When the first light of morning began to seep through the curtains, I covered my father's hands with the old quilt draped over his chair. "He looks peaceful," Vanessa said softly. "He is," I replied. "He made peace before he left. That's more than most people get." The next day passed out in slow, deliberate motions. The doctor came, neighbours offered quiet condolences, and the pastor arranged a small service. Word spread quickly through the small town, and familiar faces came by with flowers and food. People spoke kindly of my father, calling him a good man who worked hard and someone who loved his girls. I listened, unsure whether to smile or cry, because for the first time, it's time I realised those things could both be true, even with everything that had happened. The funeral was held 3 days later, simple and humble, just as he would have wanted. The winter sky hung low, heavy with grey clouds, but the air was calm. We buried him beside my mother, under the old oak tree in the churchyard. The earth was cold beneath my feet, the smell of it raw and clean. When the pastor finished his prayer, Vanessa reached for my hand. I took it without hesitation. "He's home," she said softly. I nodded, unable to speak. We stood there long after everyone else had left, the breeze rustling through the bare branches. For the first time, standing there with my sister beside me, I didn't feel like a child seeking forgiveness or belonging. I just felt whole. When we returned to the house, the lawyer was waiting for us in the living room. He was an old friend of my father's, grey-haired and soft-spoken. "Your father didn't leave much paperwork," he said gently, handing me a sealed envelope. "Just this letter. He said it would tell you everything that matters." Vanessa and I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where we had shared our last meal with him. The letter inside was written in my father's careful, uneven handwriting. I unfolded it and began to read aloud. "To my daughters, if you are reading this, it means I've gone to be with your mother. I have little to leave you, except the home we built together and the lessons I learned too late. Everything I own, this house, the land, the savings, is yours equally, equal always. I spent too much of my life building walls between you when I should have been building bridges. Don't let what I leave behind become another wall. Let it bring you together. Remember, it is not things that matter, but the people who share them with you. You are both my pride, my regret, and my redemption. Stay together and take care of each other. Love, Dad." My voice trembled on the last line. When I looked up, Vanessa's eyes were glistening. She smiled faintly. "Equal always," she repeated softly. "That sounds like him, doesn't it?" I nodded. He finally got it right. She leaned back in her chair, looking around the kitchen. The sunlight filtering through the window cast long golden streaks across the floor. "I don't want to sell the house," she said suddenly. I turned to her, surprised. "You want to keep it?" She nodded. It's old, it needs work, but it's home. I want to stay. Fix it up, maybe turn the garden into something Mum would have loved. Maybe even start a small program for families who've been through what we've been through. I think that's what Dad would have wanted. Her voice was steady, but there was a softness in her tone I hadn't heard in years. You'd be good at that, I said, making this place feel alive again. She smiled. You'll come visit, I will. I promised. Often. That night we stayed up late sorting through his things. Every drawer, every shelf seemed to hold a piece of our family story. There were old photographs, some faded, some torn at the edges, showing birthdays, picnics, even silly moments we'd long forgotten. Vanessa found our mother's wedding ring tucked in a small velvet box and held it up to the light. He kept it all this time, she said quietly. He never stopped loving her, I replied. And now, she said, closing the box there together. We packed the photos into an old wooden chest and left it by the fireplace. The night outside was silent, the moon casting silver light over the garden. I stood by the window, looking out at the lavender bushes my mother had planted decades ago. Despite the frost, a few stubborn blossoms still clung to life. Vanessa came to stand beside me. You know, she said softly when I left, I thought I'd never come back here. I thought this house was just pain. But now, I see it differently. It's not the house that hurt us. It was what we brought into it. I nodded. And what we're leaving behind. She turned to me, her expression gentle. Thank you for coming back, Steph. I smiled faintly. You found your way first, I just followed. We stood there until dawn, the first rays of light touching the horizon. The world outside was waking up, the air cool and bright with the scent of dew and soil. When it was time for me to go, Vanessa walked me to the front door. You'll be okay? I asked. She nodded. I will. I think this is where I'm supposed to be now. I hugged her tightly. Then, this is home. She smiled against my shoulder. Come back soon, I will, I said again, pulling away. I stepped out onto the porch, my breath visible in the cold morning air. The house stood quietly behind her, the rising sun painting it in shades of gold and rose. For years it had felt like a place frozen in grief. Now it looked alive again, warm, whole. As I walked to my car, I turned back one last time. Vanessa stood at the doorway, her hair catching the morning light. She lifted a hand in a small wave, and I waved back, my throat tightening. The old house glowed behind her every window, reflecting the sun like it was filled with its own quiet fire. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a promised one that began with pain and ended in peace. I smiled softly and whispered into the morning air, cool always. And then I got into my car and drove away, the road stretching ahead, the light of home fading behind me, but never leaving my heart. It has been almost 2 years since that morning, and sometimes when I wake before dawn, I still see that old house bathed in gold. The image comes to me unbidden, Vanessa standing in the doorway, the lavender fields swaying in the breeze, the sound of birds breaking the silence. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of something new, not just for her or for me, but for everyone whose lives our family had quietly touched and scarred. I returned to Boston, not as the woman who had once walked away from that home in pain, but as someone lighter, quieter, more certain of herself. My research had resumed by then, but something inside me had shifted. The awards, the invitations, the speaking engagements, they no longer felt important. The world still called me Dr. Stephanie Cooper, the woman behind the life-saving device. But I began to realize that my work wasn't just about innovation anymore. It was about people. A few months after my father's passing, I started a small foundation using the remainder of my research grant funds. At first, it was simple free clinics for children who couldn't afford treatment, mobile health units in underserved towns, scholarships for young women in science. I named it the HAIL Initiative, a quiet nod to the man I'd never known my biological father, and to the word itself, HAIL, meaning healthy or whole. That was what I wanted to give back, a sense of wholeness to those who had been made to feel incomplete. The first clinic opened in a small coastal town not far from Haven Point. where Vanessa still lived. She came to the opening ceremony, standing quietly in the back of the crowd, her hands clasped together. When I spotted her, we exchanged a look that said more than words ever could. Later that day, she helped hand out blankets and warm meals to families who came for checkups. Watching her speak softly with a frightened child, I realized that forgiveness had transformed us both, not just into better sisters, but into better people. As the months passed, the foundation grew faster than I could have imagined. Volunteers came from across the state. Local news stations covered our work, then national ones. Somewhere along the way, the headlines changed from stories about my inventions to stories about compassion. The woman who forgave her family. One article called me. I remember seeing it on a magazine cover at the airport and laughing softly to myself. The old me would have worried about the title, about what people might think. But now, I simply folded it and slipped it into my bag. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that peace isn't earned through recognition. It's found in the quiet spaces after the noise fades. One afternoon, I was sitting in my office at the foundation headquarters, a modest building overlooking the harbour, when my colleague Dr. Lee stopped by. She was young, bright, eager, the kind of person who reminded me of myself 15 years ago. "You've really made it, Dr. Cooper," she said with a smile, setting down a stack of papers. "The world knows your name, your work's changing lives, and you're on the shortlist for the Humanitarian Award next month." How does it feel? I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the soft ripple of waves against the docks. The sunlight reflected off the water in shimmering patterns that danced across the walls. "You know," I said after a moment, "you only realise you've made it when you stop trying to prove it." She tilted her head, smiling in that curious, hopeful way of someone still learning how to measure success. "That's beautiful," she said softly. I smiled back, though it wasn't beauty I had been thinking about. It was relief. I had spent so much of my life striving to be seen, to be validated by people who couldn't recognise me. Now, for the first time, it didn't matter who was watching. That evening, after everyone had left the office, I stayed behind for a while, sorting through letters sent to the foundation. Many were simple thank you notes, written in uneven handwriting or typed by shaky hands. Parents thanking us for their children's surgeries. Young students sharing how our scholarships had changed their futures. One letter stood out, a short note written on a torn piece of paper from Haven Point. "Thank you for helping us remember what kindness looks like. V.C." I traced my fingers over the initials and smiled. Vanessa's handwriting was still the same elegant, looping certain. I pictured her there tending to her garden, helping neighbours, living quietly by the sea. She called, sometimes, not often, but enough to remind me that the distance between us no longer carried pain. It carried peace. I left the office and walked home through the soft glow of the harbour lights. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of salt and lilacs. The city hummed with its usual rhythm, cars' laughter, the distant sound of a saxophone playing from a balcony. For years, I had walked these streets with my head down, lost in the thoughts of what I hadn't yet accomplished. Now I simply walked. I belonged to the world and to myself in equal measure. When I reached my townhouse, the porch light flickered on automatically. My neighbours' children were playing in the small front yard, their laughter bright against the quiet street. I waved as I passed, and they waved back, their faces full of that easy joy only children carry. "Hi, Miss Stephanie," one of them called, a little girl with curly hair and a missing front tooth. She ran up to me, clutching a stuffed rabbit in one hand. "Mum said you help people who are sick." "Is that true?" I smiled, kneeling down so we were eye to eye. "That's true. I try to help in any way I can." She looked at me with the kind of frankness only a child can have. "That's nice. My teacher says people who help others are heroes." I laughed softly. "Oh, I don't know about that. I think helping people just makes you human." She nodded seriously, as if weighing my words. Then she asked the kind of question that stopped me cold. "Miss Stephanie, were you ever sad?" For a moment I couldn't answer. The air around us seemed to still. I looked at her, so innocent, so curious. and felt the question settle deep inside me. I thought of the lonely years, the cold words, the long road back to forgiveness. I thought of my parents, of Vanessa of the house, now blooming again with lavender. I thought of the silence I had carried and how it had shaped me into someone who could finally speak with kindness. Yes, I said finally, my voice soft, but sure, I was very sad once. But then I learnt something important. Her eyes widened. What? That sadness, I said, isn't the end of your story. Sometimes it's just where it begins. She smiled as if she understood in the way only children somehow do, and then skipped off toward her porch humming a tune I didn't recognise. I stood there for a moment, watching her, the porch light casting a warm glow on the quiet street. The stars were beginning to appear above the harbour, faint but certain. And as I turned the key in my door, I realised that life had finally come full circle, not through revenge or triumph, but through grace. And maybe, I thought, as I stepped inside, the real measure of a life well lived isn't in what you achieve, but in what you give back once you've learnt how to heal. The house was quiet when I came in that evening. The harbour lights flickered softly through the curtains, and the city hummed outside, calm and alive. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the stars shimmer across the dark water. Once nights like this had made me ache with loneliness. Now they filled me with peace, the kind that comes when you stop wishing the past were different. The next afternoon brought a light knock at my door. When I opened it, there stood Lily, the little girl from next door clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her cheeks were pink from the autumn wind. "Hi, Miss Stephanie," she said proudly. "Mum said I could visit if I'm quiet." I smiled and stepped aside. "Then you're in good company." She followed me to the living room where the fire crackled gently. I poured her some cocoa and sat across from her. Her eyes moved from the bookshelf to the framed photos on the mantel pictures, from the foundation, smiling children letters of thanks. "You have a lot of pictures," she said. "Are they all yours?" "Some," I said. "Some are from people I helped. Each one tells a story." Her eyes lit up. "Can you tell me one?" I hesitated. I told my story before, but always on stages to reporters behind practiced words. Never like this. Looking at her so small and open, I felt something soften. Maybe it was time to tell it the way it truly was, simple, honest, human. "All right," I said. "I'll tell you the story of the blue dress and two sisters." Lily leaned forward, chin in her hands. Once I began, there were two sisters. One was bold, charming, loved by everyone. The other was quiet, thoughtful, and gentle. She liked helping people and never needed to be the centre of attention. But people didn't understand her. They said she was plain and they laughed when she didn't try to stand out. Even her parents worried she'd never shine. Lily frowned. "That's not nice." "No," I said softly, "but sometimes life starts unfair and still ends beautifully." One day, I continued, the bold sister got married. It was a grand wedding full of guests. The quiet sister came wearing a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself. But when she walked in, her family laughed. Her sister pointed and said, "She looks like the help." Everyone joined in. Lily's small hands tightened around her mug. "That's mean," she whispered. "It was," I said. The quiet sister wanted to run away. But then something happened. The groom stood up, walked across the room, bowed and said, "Mom, it's an honour to meet you." His mother had once been very sick and the quiet sister's invention had saved her life. He hadn't known they were family. Suddenly, everyone fell silent. Lily gasped. "So everyone found out she was special?" "Yes," I said, but not because she wanted them to know, because she already was. The truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be seen. "What about her mean sister?" Lily asked. "She was angry," I said softly, but mostly she was lost. She'd spent her life trying to look perfect because she didn't feel loved enough inside. The quiet sister saw that. She didn't fight back. She just walked away. They didn't speak for a long time. But life has a way of bringing people back when they're ready. "What happened after?" "They grew," I said. The quiet sister learned her voice didn't need to be loud to be heard. People used to laugh at her for being silent now. They listened when she spoke softly. And the other sister learned that love isn't about being admired. It's about being real. Eventually, they forgave each other, and they helped others the way they wished someone had helped them. Lily was quiet for a while, thinking, did they see their mum and dad again? They did, I said, and they made peace before their father passed. He made them promise one thing, to stay together. And they did. Lily nodded slowly. And the blue dress, I smiled, glancing toward the closet, where it still hung, pressed and untouched. She kept it, I said, because it reminded her that being herself was never something to be ashamed of. Lily smiled. I have a yellow dress. People say it's too bright, but I like it. Then wear it proudly, I said. The best things we wear are the ones that make us feel like ourselves. She sipped her cocoa, thoughtful. Miss Stephanie, she said after a moment, what happened to your sister? Her question caught me by surprise. I hadn't realised how deeply she'd listened. I looked toward the window where the afternoon light was fading into pink and gold. The same colours I remembered from that day outside the community centre when Vanessa had turned and said my name like it was an apology. She found her way home, I said finally. It took time, but she did. Sometimes people lose themselves for a while, but when they remember who they are and who loves them, they always find their way back. Lily's eyes brightened. So, they were happy again. They were, I said softly, maybe not the same as before, but better. Because they finally saw each other clearly. She smiled, then glanced at the empty mug in her hands. I like happy endings. I smiled too. So do I. The fire crackled quietly between us. The room glowed gold and warm. I thought of Vanessa tending her lavender garden, by the sea laughing with the children who came to help. She had become who she was always meant to be, kind, humble, free. And sitting there watching Lily trace patterns in the steam of her cup, I realised something. Our stories aren't meant to be locked away. They're meant to be told honestly, softly, so that someone else can carry a little of their light forward. Lily looked up at me again. Will you tell me another story next time, maybe, I said with a smile, but only if you promise to remember this one. I promise, she whispered. The firelight flickered across her face, and for a moment she looked like hope itself, small, bright, and full of belief. I reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, and said quietly, then that's enough. It had been 3 months since that afternoon with Lily. Winter had melted away and spring was beginning to colour the world again. The air smelled of wet soil and new beginnings. My days were steady now, work at the foundation, quiet evenings by the harbour, and a peace that no longer felt fragile. Then, one morning, a message came from Vanessa. I am planting something. Come if you can. 2 days later, I was driving toward Haven Point again. The roads were the same, winding through tall pines and open fields, but the drive no longer carried the heaviness it once had. I was going home not to the pain that shaped me, but to the love that survived it. When I reached the cemetery on the hill, Vanessa was already there. She stood by our parents' graves, a small bundle of blue flowers in her hands. The wind lifted her hair gently, and when she turned, her smile was soft but sure. You came, she said. I said I would, I replied. For a while, neither of us spoke. The graves were simple side by side, the earth between them, covered with the lavender we'd planted last spring. Vanessa knelt, brushing away a few stray leaves. I thought maybe we could add something new, she said, showing me the flowers. Blue gentians, my mother's favourite. She loved these, I said. She said they looked like courage. Vanessa smiled faintly. I think she'd like that we're planting them together. We worked in silence, the soil soft beneath our hands. The wind carried the scent of earth and sea, and somewhere in the distance church bells rang faintly. It felt right, 2 sisters who had once been strangers in the same house, now tending the same ground. When we finished, Vanessa sat back, dirt smudged on her fingers. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I spent so long trying to prove I was better. Perfect, even. But all that pretending, it just made me smaller." I looked at her, seeing not the polished woman who used to mock me, but someone stripped down to her truth. "We all pretend when we're afraid," I said. "It just takes time to stop." Her eyes filled with tears. "I hurt so many people, Steph. You most of all. I don't expect you to forget it." "I haven't," I said gently. "But I forgave you anyway." She looked at me for a long time, her expression breaking into a quiet, tearful smile. "I don't know how you did it, because holding on was heavier," I said simply. Forgiving let me breathe again. The truth was, forgiveness had become my strength, the quiet kind that no one sees, the kind that makes peace feel possible. Vanessa stood and brushed off her hands. "I wanted this place to feel alive again," she said, "not just like a reminder of what we lost." I looked down at the blue gentians, their petals glowing in the fading light. "You've done that," I said. "You've brought life back." She smiled. We both did. We walked toward the edge of the hill, the sky painted in pink and lavender. The air was cool and soft, carrying the sound of waves below. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked if we'd been kinder sooner. "All the time," I admitted. "But maybe this was how we were meant to learn. The hard way stays longer." She nodded, wiping her cheek. "You're right. It's strange, isn't it? We spent our whole lives fighting, and now I can't imagine life without you." I laughed softly. "That's what family's for, to drive you crazy until you can't help but love them." She grinned. "Dad would have liked that." I smiled. He'd like this too, seeing us together. Peaceful. We turned back to the graves. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, the petals trembling but unbroken. I crouched beside them, pressing my hand against the soil. The earth was cool, alive. "You know," I said quietly, "forgiveness didn't make me weak. It made me free." Vanessa knelt beside me, her voice almost a whisper. "Free enough to start over." "Free enough to stop needing to," I said. "This is enough." She reached for my hand, and for a long moment we just stayed there, our fingers touching over the flowers. The years between us, the cruelty, the silence, the shame had all settled into something softer, like dust finally resting after a storm. The breeze picked up again, tugging gently at the petals. A few lifted from their stems and drifted upward, turning slow circles in the air. We watched them float higher, light as breath, until they disappeared into the sky. Vanessa smiled. "Do you ever think Mum would forgive us too?" "I think she already has," I said. "She just needed us to forgive each other first." The sun was dipping low now, its light warm and golden. The world felt quiet in that way only peace can be. We stood side by side, two women who had once been strangers, now bound not by blood or guilt, but by choice. "She became your best friend, didn't she?" Vanessa asked softly, half teasing. I looked at her, a smile spreading across my face. "She did," I said. "Eventually." We both laughed, a real unguarded laugh that felt like the first one we'd shared since childhood. Then the wind rose again, stronger this time, scattering a few petals across the grass. They danced between us, carried higher and higher until they vanished into the sunset. I watched them drift away light and free, and whispered goodbye and thank you. The world fell still. The breeze softened. And in that silence filled with love, forgiveness, and the scent of blue flowers, I finally understood what it meant to come full circle. And that, my friends, is how one quiet woman found her voice, not through anger or revenge, but through forgiveness and grace. Stephanie's journey wasn't a story of triumph over others. It was a story of triumph over pain. She learned that the power to forgive is the greatest strength of all, not because it changes the past, but because it frees you from it. The blue flowers she planted with her sister were more than symbols of forgiveness. They were a promise that love once broken can still grow back if you're brave enough to nurture it. Her story reminds us that healing doesn't happen in a single moment. It begins with small choices. The choice to listen instead of blame, to understand instead of resent, and to let go instead of holding on. Maybe you've been in her place. Maybe you've carried hurt from someone who should have protected you. Or maybe you're the one who caused the pain and wish you could take it back. Either way, Stephanie's story asks us one powerful question. When the moment comes, will you cling to pride or will you choose peace? If you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Could you forgive someone who mocked you in front of the world, who tore you down when you only ever tried to love them? Or would you have walked away for good? I want to hear your thoughts. Share them below, your reflections, your experiences, your stories of strength and second chances. Because every comment here reminds someone else that they're not alone in their journey toward healing. This story is for everyone who's ever been underestimated, ignored, or made to feel small. It's for the people who stayed kind when life was unkind, who carried grace even when they had every reason not to. Stephanie's quiet courage shows that being gentle doesn't mean being weak. It means being powerful enough to stay true to yourself when the world tries to make you hard. If her story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Each week, we share stories about love, forgiveness, and the strength that comes from compassion. And if this story reminded you of someone, a sister, a friend, a parent, maybe it's time to reach out. Because forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It releases what no longer serves you. It's how you find peace, how you grow, and how you finally set yourself free.